welcome you here to this afternoon's Oversight Committee. The principal business before us is some of our investigation work into the Garden Bridge project. We're very pleased to welcome Margaret Hodge, who did the Mayor's independent review, David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff, and Mike Brown, Commissioner for Transport for London. Before we get to that main piece of business, can we just do some tidying up issues? So apologies for absence. Who have we got apologies
We've got
from?
Apologies from Dr. Ron Castlehota AM, for who Joanne McCartney AM is substituting chair, and apologies from Gareth Bacon AM, Deputy Chairman, for whom Andrew Boff AM is substituting.
Okay, moving on then, can we just be clear about declarations of interest? Can we note the list of officers held by Assembly members? Members are asked to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda and declare any other relevant interests. Are there any?
It's not. I don't think it's relevant to anything on the agenda, but I've not declared it yet. So Gibson Hospitality, BFI, Gala film screening.
Okay, you can do that if members wish to do it now or do it by the email process. Thank you for that. Moving on to item 3 then, the minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of our meeting on the 14th of September 2017 so I can sign them as a correct record? That's agreed?
Yeah,
thank
agreed.
you. And can we note the item 4, summary list of actions arising from our previous meetings? Thank you. Can we now turn to item 5, which is the independent review on the Garden Bridge and lessons learned? I've done the welcomes. We've got a number of formal questions that we collectively have decided that we want to ask concerning this report to you all. And then there will no doubt be additional questions arising from your answers or particular issues that members wish to raise. So if I can begin in terms of my set of first questions, and it's to you, Margaret. Can you just outline to the committee the main findings of your review?
Well, I think probably I'd start with, I think the difficulties that the project faced arose because of the lack of clarity about purpose. And it started with that. And I think if we got the purpose clearly defined, you might then have been able to do a proper project plan and you might have got the funding properly sorted. That lack of clarity about purpose led to value for money concerns, and particularly right throughout, you've escalating costs the whole time, which never seem to be properly sort of brought under control, and a less and less convincing case on value for money terms for proceeding. I think that was the second one. So lack of clarity, value for money. I then think that the lack of transparency throughout the process, which was probably linked to the mayoral direction issue, was another aspect of it, which I think if there had been greater transparency all the way through, people might have halted, thought better, considered sort of, alternative routes forward. I mean, there might have been just a much better thing. And I think that's the third thing I would say is lack of transparency. And the fourth thing I would say is a failure of the checks that exist in the system. Because there are checks, they just, there was a sort of abuse, I think, of the protocols around checks in the system, whether within TfL or elsewhere throughout. And I think those would be my 4 key findings from it.
And in your experience of reviewing public expenditure in terms of in another place, what surprised you most during this review?
I think I think that total lack of regard for due process. I was quite taken aback about that, and actually, then looking back on it, because I was in on the development of this organisation, and I think what happened then, it was a Labour government that established it, and I think what we were trying to do was leave the mayor free from too much bureaucracy to really do visionary things for London. That was the concept of it. And I think in doing that, we probably didn't give enough regard to ensuring that the proper checks are in place where people would tend to abuse, to have a slight abuse of power. So I thought that was the first thing. And I think the other thing, as you go through and you look at the funding and the ability to raise private finance, I think the other thing that really surprised me all the way through in the discussions I had with the stakeholders, was a real, it seemed to be a failure to engage effectively with people around and garner sort of support for the project. If you're doing something as big as that with an impact and quite, very innovative, quite controversial, I think, think about the wheel. You do a lot of work beforehand to try and bring people with you. And I know the Garden Bridge Trust have been critical of, they say I've had a one-sided. I didn't have a one-sided review. It was really all that came at me was a lot of people who might even have supported it in an early stage, but then once they got into the deal and understood what was involved in it, withdrew their support. So I felt, why on earth didn't people engage more actively with the ordinary people? It was supposed to be the People's Bridge, but I'm not sure which people it served. And I think those would be the two things that I'd say: lack of regard for due process and failure to engage effectively.
And I suppose, Loxley, coming to your view and the advice you gave the Mayor, what would have happened if the project had continued? Given the evidence that you had from officials and from the Trust and others, what do you think would have been the likely scenario had the Mayor followed through on the commitment to underwrite the Garden Bridge? What do you think would have happened?
This is really my judgment.
Yep.
So it was a complete personal judgment call. But what I looked at here was both the discussions I had with Garden Bridge Trust, and particularly Paul Morell, and also the papers I got from the National Audit Office, the papers I got from Treasury. Treasury looked again at the business case, and the history. And it's a guesstimate then, so it's difficult to hold me to it, but I came to the view we had spent, Londoners had spent, both taxpayers and council taxpayers had spent, getting on for £40 million, I can't remember, £37 million, whatever it was on it. I thought it would end up being over £100 million of public money. That was actually what I sort of, in my head came to. Partly because Paul said it was now north of £200 million. In his discussion with me, and that was again before a spade had gone into the ground. So it was partly all those costs were escalating, however, I know it was a fixed price contract, but the failure to keep the team together meant that they would have had to recruit a team again, and they'd have been into a lot of variations on the contract. So there was that, and then I just couldn't feel the realism of their being able to raise private finance given the controversial nature of the project. If you're a philanthropist or a corporation, you want something back for your investment of that nature, and in a controversial a project of this sort, I think it's difficult to see what they'd have got back. And I simply couldn't believe that they would be able to raise the money for the management and maintenance, particularly if the Mayor had given the guarantee, because if you've got the guarantee there, why on earth would you, as a funder, think there was any point putting your money into something if, in fact, the Mayor had underwritten it anyway?
Okay, let's
but
return.
I have to stress, that is my own view.
And judgment based on what you'd heard and read.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to David, to you. In terms of what was the Mayor's expectation for this review, and can you also sort of, from a number of Assembly members' point of view, why did it take so long for him to come to request the review?
Okay. In terms of the kind of the purpose of the review, obviously largely that's set out in the terms of reference, which are in Margaret's report and also in the relevant mayoral decision, so Assembly members will be familiar with those. I think there are probably two particular reasons beyond that I would highlight. Firstly, that this project had clearly quite a lot of complex history that predated this administration, and it clearly was helpful to have somebody who was able to get to the bottom of that and ensure the mayor had a clear understanding of what was going on, and also that the London taxpayer had a clear understanding, given the amount of public funds that it's obvious went into that. Secondly, clearly there was a decision towards the mayor about whether to give guarantees for the operation and maintenance of the bridge, and given that those guarantees may need to run for centuries, given that we're talking about the lifespan of a bridge here, it's definitely a very repercussive decision for any mayor to have to take. And so clearly in that context, the mayor wished to ensure that he had good independent advice to consider. In terms of timing, things did take a little while. The mayor, I think, came to the conclusion at some point mid to late July that a review of this nature would be a good idea. He asked me to approach Margaret to see if she would be prepared to do it, given her experiences on the Public Accounts Committee. We spoke and we agreed to meet. Unfortunately, our holidays were sequential, and so it wasn't until the start of September which we could actually sit down and we could discuss what this might involve. And then Margaret was able to consider and confirm that she would like to do things, and that then led a couple of weeks to finalise terms of reference, work out administrative support and so on, up to the announcement of the review on 22nd September.
Thank you. And if I come to you, Mike, we'll talk about the views of TfL towards the report probably later on in the questioning. But just to ascertain in terms of your involvement in the final report, so how were you and your organisation involved in the review from your perspective? Do you feel that TfL had opportunities to put their side of particular accounts to this project?
Well, yes, I do. Certainly from those people who work for TfL now, or at the time of the review, which is the only people I can talk for with any confidence, because clearly people who used to work here or used to work with the previous mayor, that was a different issue. But certainly from my perspective, Chair, yes, absolutely. I met with Margaret, as did some members of my team, and I got a sense that it was a very full and thorough line of questioning that was perfectly appropriate in the circumstances of the review as the mayor had requested. Okay,
and your organisation provided additional information that wasn't already in the public domain?
Yeah, we basically were, I made it very clear to the organisation that we would be fully open and transparent as part of the review. If you're going to have a review, I think it's really important, as you, Chair, and other Assembly members will understand, that that's as open as it possibly can be if it's going to have the value that it should have. So, absolutely.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I move on to the next questioner, is there any questions that members want to ask in terms of that first round of questions? No? Okay, let's move on then to section 2. Andrew, Assembly Member Boff.
Thank you. Dame Margaret, the Garden Bridge Trust claims that the political uncertainty caused by the change in administration and the review itself was responsible for the difficulty in fundraising. Do you agree with that assessment?
No.
Okay.
I think if you look at the history of when they raised something like £85 million, and then they lost. I hope my figures are right here. Some months since I looked at it. I'll come back to you if I've got my figures wrong. All right. But
Chair, Commissioner, I'll help. So, from Margaret's report, funds pledged, and obviously that's pledged to the trust. Margaret reported that spring 2015 was £85 million. As of May 2016, which obviously when the mayoral election was and some months before the review was announced, the funds pledged had reduced to £69 million. So you can see that there was a reduction in funds pledged in advance in the change of mayoralty. Never mind this review.
Thank you.
And also, I mean, I have to say, around the fundraising, it was, because I did talk to the Garden Bridge Trust about it when they came to see me, although they were somewhat reluctant to reveal a lot to me. I know they then sent critical and said I didn't. I did ask them questions, but they sort of slightly closed down on that line of questioning. I've, done a lot of fundraising, as you know, Andrew, in my time, and it sort of felt to me that quite a lot of it wasn't sort of copper bottom money. There wasn't money in the bank. And that felt a bit fragile to me. I was a bit suspect of the fact that so many were anonymous. Now, I appreciate that some philanthropists do like to maintain anonymity, but the extent of anonymous pledges was quite large in this instance. And, that made me feel a bit nervous about how solid those pledges were. And there was nothing to stop them. And I think, right, Sadiq said right from the start, there was nothing to stop them carrying on raising money. But when you get to a controversial project, it's difficult to raise money in any circumstances. But if you're with a controversial project, as this had become, it didn't start like that, it became a controversial project. Once you're in that, it's much, much more difficult to get investors who will always want to return for their philanthropic contribution. It's much, much more difficult to get them engaged. So I think we've just got to be a bit realistic. I know, and they had nothing. They had nothing. They lost money since the election. They never gained any, or they were never able to demonstrate any new pledges.
Did you meet with any of the donors?
Pardon?
Did you meet with any of the donors?
No. Nobody asked me. Let me just explain this to you, because actually I put out, anybody who wanted could have come to see me. Anybody who wanted could have come to see me. And if a donor had wanted to come and see me, my door was open. For example, originally I hadn't meant to meet, I didn't have in my programme meeting the architects who had not got who had bid for the contract that Heatherwick was awarded. They approached and wanted to come and see me, and that was fine. I also had people could have written to me. I got quite a lot of letters. People could have given me those. And if the trust had wanted me to meet their donors, I was quite open to that. And just something, because the trust has also said that I only met people who were against the scheme. And I've done a little analysis of that, just out of interest. And out of the 25 sort of meetings I had, 7 were in favour. 7 were with people who were in favour. 6 were in people who were against, and 12 were neutral. So I don't think there was any bias even there. And I didn't do that deliberately. That's looking at an analysis now of actually what was the nature of the people who came and talked to me. 7 in favour.
Would it be fair to say that the majority of people who came to see you to give evidence were invited by yourself to come and talk to you?
I invited people to start with, and then people suggested other people. So it was a bit of an iterative process.
But you didn't invite any donors?
I wasn't asked to invite donors,
Well,
and no donor wrote to me. Pardon?
You weren't asked to invite anyone, were you?
I was. People
names?
suggested.
Who asked
various.
You to invite?
I had evidence from TfL officials, and they would suggest maybe somebody else should come in as a TfL official that I hadn't dealt with.
But nobody suggested a donor?
Nobody, including the Garden Bridge Trust, suggested that I speak to a donor. And no donor, this is the other thing, a donor could perfectly well have said, I'd like to come and talk to you about this. No donor approached me, and had they done so, I would have talked to them.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, have you investigated the concerns that the Garden Bridge raised about how the review was carried out?
I haven't investigated those concerns, no.
Okay. Mr. Bellamy, have you conducted any investigation what the Garden Bridge Trust says as problems with the review? Have you investigated this?
As the Mayor said in his letter of 28th April, announcing his decision around guarantees for the project, he was aware of the letter to Dame Margaret from the Trust, which of course was a letter that was issued publicly, so everybody's had the opportunity to see that, and that that had that been considered in his decision making.
Did Dame Margaret, did the GLA offer any meeting facilities at the GLA for you to conduct your work?
I don't think we ever got to that, really. No, I didn't. I don't think I don't think we asked. I don't think I asked or was offered. I can't remember being asked or offered.
And are you a friend of the mayor, Dame Margaret?
Of course, yeah. But hang on a minute, Andrew. Because hang on a minute. If you're suggesting that in some way I was approached by him, I mean, you know, he's a member of my party. He was a London MP. I've known him for goodness knows how many years, and we have worked together and socialised together over the term. But the implication, if you are trying to make from that an implication that somehow a personal relationship biased my review, it didn't. And I was absolutely clear at the start when David first came to see me that I did not have a view on the bridge. It hadn't crossed my desk, and I hadn't, you know, I'm an outer London MP, I'm not an inner London MP. The only thing I would have said would have been we need more bridges out on the east, less in the centre, but that might have been my only partisan view. But apart from that, if the implication is that well, you asked the question, so I'm simply saying to you, I knew the mayor, he is a friend of mine, but that had absolutely no impact on the nature, the approach, or the conclusions of my report.
Thank you for that very full reply. A question doesn't have an opinion.
Sorry?
A question doesn't have an opinion, so...
well, it has an implication. It has an implication.
I
And I just want to make that position clear.
Did you, towards the end of the session that you had with Thomas Hetherington, you said that, that you hadn't completed the interview with him. Did you go on to complete that interview with Thomas Hetherington?
I felt that actually I got enough out of it, so there was no need to reconvene. I didn't think any value would be added.
You came to that conclusion subsequent to the meeting?
Yes, after I talked to lots of other people.
Right. In the evidence raised by when you interviewed Joanna Lumley, she made a reference to an instruction that had been sent out to Labour mayoral candidates that and that information was conveyed to her by David Lammy. Did you interview David Lammy with regard to those that evidence?
You'll have to remind me, Andrew. Do you know that interview with Joanna Lumley took place when?
A little while ago. You're quite right.
Okay. So if you send me,
it was 1st of December 2016.
Okay.
I'm happy to.
If you send it to me,
Well,
I'll have a look at it. And
I'm happy
to be absolutely honest, I can't remember.
I'm happy to do my best Joanna Lumley diction and say to you is as follows. Before the last election, I'm reluctant. This is Joanna Lumley speaking. And I'm reluctant to say this, but I have to say, because it's important for me, David Lammy phoned me up, who's a friend of mine, and said, why is it that on our list for being mayoral candidates, we have to say that we will suppress or cancel the Garden Bridge? Tell me what the Garden Bridge is, what's so wrong with it? This is what David Lammy supposedly said. So I talked to him and I said, I don't know this. It was approved by the Labour Mayor of London. When I first took it to him, Ken Livingstone, he thought it was great. I had no idea, he said. Well, we have to tick that. We have to say that we would suppress the Garden Bridge. Did you not know that? And then you're then saying, I don't think that's true. And Joanna Lumley says, well, why did David Lammy phone me? Wasn't that enough?
What did I say to that?
You said, I have no idea, but anyway, that's slightly outside my terms of reference. You know, I don't want to be unfair to you anyway. Why was it outside the reference when it directly affected the future of the Garden Bridge?
Because my terms of reference weren't to judge whether this was a good or bad idea. My terms of reference were to judge, if you look back at the actual terms of reference on it, were to judge value for money for the public. Let's make sure I read this to you properly. To assess the public sector contribution to the Garden Bridge project, whether value for money had been achieved, to investigate the conduct of Transport for London, the Greater London Authority and other relevant authorities in regard to the Garden Bridge project, to achieve this through assessing the findings of previous reviews, interviewing current and former GLA and TfL staff and other stakeholders, and investigating more deeply as required to set out any lessons that should be learnt in order to improve the conduct of potential and approved projects in the future, and to produce a report for the Mayor of London, which will be published in full. And I stuck to those terms of reference.
So you didn't think that that was relevant despite it being a major part of what Joanna Lumley said to you about the decision-making process?
Will you read out again what I actually said to her?
Yes, I have no idea, but that's slightly outside my terms of reference.
Quite.
Yeah. But you didn't think that that was, bearing in mind she quoted that, you didn't think that that was sufficient?
But read it again.
That you didn't think it was outside the terms of reference. I get that. And that's the position you're holding, which is fine. When... Do you understand why... First of all, let's go on to the evidence. You referred in your report a number of times to evidence, but there doesn't appear to be anything in the way of references from your report to reference documents or anything like that. Was that deliberate not to have references?
I think that... what are you particularly concerned about where I'm unreferenced? Where do I make an assertion that you think is not referenced?
You make a number of assertions about what's the situation at the time, the situation at TfL. You make references to procedures.
Can you just give me an example, please?
You do reference procedures at TfL within your report.
Yeah, go on. I'm just trying to think of an example of where.
Well, that's
where
it.
am I?
That's
where
it.
am I? Where are you being feeling that I should have?
You're making references. You admit that you've made references to TfL's procedures.
What's that?
You know.
So, but it was, you started this questioning by saying to me, I didn't reference the evidence in the assertions I made. All I would like you to do to make this an easier conversation is to
do you reference,
lead me to somewhere where I said something which you feel is unevidenced.
Do you at any point reference TfL's internal procedures for procurement?
Where is that not? Can I go back, Andrew, to what you asked? You said you have made certain assertions without reference to the evidence. Okay,
yes.
That's where this conversation is at.
All
I'm asking of you is point me to. I have got the report here. I hope you have. I haven't got the evidence because there's mountains of it. But show me somewhere in the report where you think I make where I say something which you feel I haven't evidenced.
You made a reference to the invitation to tender on paragraph 53.
Paragraph
you don't
53.
reference that invitation to tender.
The invitation was formally launched on 13th of February. Yeah.
No reference to it.
Pardon?
No reference to that information, that data.
Ah, well.
The reason I haven't got sorry, Dame Margaret, I'm sorry, I'm being unfair. The reason I haven't got those individual references is because the report is littered with such references about procedures within TfL, about the way in which things should be done, and yet at no point do we find any references in your report. I don't understand why there are no references.
Well, if there is a question, I mean, I just didn't, it would have been a lot of other work to put in the references. If there is something that you think I have made an assertion which is for which there is no evidence, I'd like you to demonstrate that to me. I think the paragraph that you have demonstrated there, if I read it to the committee so that they all know what we're talking about, the invitation to tender for the bridge design services contract was formally launched on the 13th of February 2013. Probably, actually, this committee, I probably got that out of the minutes out of this committee. although all three firms that were invited to tender were notified of the impending tender on the 8th of February. I probably got that out of this committee. I mean, one of the sources would have been this committee. I've got a box full of references at home. You're very welcome. I'm not good to have my box full. The firms were Marks Barfield Architects, Wilson and Heatherwick Studio.
Well, that's useful you've said that, then, Margaret, because one of the things I was going to move on to is, will you actually release all the evidence that's been made available to you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, David would have to sort of, the GLA would have to have a look at what it is they gave me, but and whether it's.
I think so. Well, Andrew, on that particular issue, page 42 of our own report references where we got that information from, and we got that information from TfL, and it would have been in your numerous papers of FII requests as well as TfL information passed to you.
Thank you for the helpful suggestion, Chair. Of course, you didn't. Your report, Dame Margaret's report, didn't even reference our report. You might have mentioned it, but it didn't reference it. So, can we move on to?
I'm not sure what benefit that would have been. I'm not sure what you're getting at. If the assertion is, there has to be a purpose of questioning, if I may say so. If the assertion is that I've made assertions here that are not based on evidence, please give them to me, and I will then try and answer to you as to why I came to that view. And where it is my own view. I don't want you to think that I came to decisions here out of the top of my head. I didn't. It is all. I spent a lot of time actually going through evidence from this committee, evidence from government, evidence from TfL and others.
You can make that evidence available to
What?
You can make that evidence available.
Well, I'm subject to the GLA, TfL, I'm not sure, I don't know quite how it works.
I don't have the magic piece of paper with me, it seems, to my irritation. When Dame Margaret was appointed to do the review, officers pulled together a suite of reading for her to start. My understanding is that all that stuff should be referenced. There's a Transport for London webpage which has, in the interest of the transparency that perhaps at one stage this project lacked, has a whole load of things on there. And I think, the bulk of what we were trying to do to set Dame Margaret up was to give her that as a fairly copious reading pack. So my belief is that, all that stuff is out there on the TfL website for everybody's reading pleasure. Clearly, there may have been additional pieces of paper that people presented to you during the review that I and the GLA wouldn't know about, but clearly, as a public body, our obligations to publish things are there, and we would always abide by those.
Thank you. Dame Margaret, was it at your request that the Mayor tried to prevent the Assembly from having the transcripts?
No.
Okay.
I'm not sure that's true. Is that true?
That's not true at all.
Okay. I must have been asking questions in a parallel universe then to come to that conclusion. Was the deadline for your report, was that unreasonable?
There wasn't a deadline.
So why did you determine that was the date in which it should be released?
I had hoped to finish it earlier, but I had personal circumstances which meant I had a couple of months off.
Okay. When did you ask for the £9,000 for payment for the report?
I didn't.
You did not ask for it at any point. When was it? Who offered it to you?
Chair, I met with Dame Margaret and the external lawyers that we were commissioning to ensure everything was in order before the report's publication. That meeting took place from memory on the 15th of March. At the end of that meeting, I spoke, as I've written to Assemblymember Boff separately and made clear and explained the circumstances. I felt that having gone through what we went through with the lawyers and hearing about the scope of work, it had taken significantly more effort from Dame Margaret than perhaps we'd realised when we commissioned the work, and that in that circumstance payment was appropriate. Also, I was personally uncomfortable about the fact that we'd made a payment to a male parliamentarian for doing a review for the Mayor, but not done that for a female parliamentarian. So on that basis, I asked Dame Margaret if she'd be prepared to accept remuneration, and subsequent to that spoke with officers to determine a proportionate amount consistent with payments made for other reviews and work carried out for the Mayor.
Thank you. Did you get any peer review of your reports?
It was my report.
So no
It was
peer.
my report.
Yeah, but no peer review of
Yes,
the
my
of the
report.
findings.
It was always
Okay.
my report.
Why did you accept the 9,000 when originally it was supposed to be work you were doing for free?
Well, originally I had thought this was a 3-month job. What I committed to was a day a week over 3 months. That was originally what I. When I got into the work, and I did a very thorough job. It just took me much longer. I mean, I'm trying to work out how many hours. So my weekends over a long period were immersed in documents around the Garden Bridge Review, reading those and trying to sort of make sense of different things said by different people at different times, especially a lot of the FOI stuff. So I spent, I don't know, hours, absolutely hours and hours, much more than I had thought. So if I'm absolutely honest, if I'd realised how much it was, I might not have undertaken, because it did for weeks was consume my weekends.
Had you ever written a report before on your own?
Oh God, yes. Down the years, I've written loads of reports.
What reference?
I've been around a long time, Andrew.
Yes. What references, haven't we both? What references did you look at in the way in which you, on standards of reports and how they should be presented? Did you use any particular guideline or?
I think I've read and written sufficient reports on these sort of issues to be able to make a judgment on what I think is appropriate and not appropriate.
And did you ever cross-reference back to reports from the House of Commons about their standards for reports?
I cross-referenced to reports. I mean, I had a lot of information from government in various guises. So the NAO, the Public Accounts Committee, the Treasury, the Department of Transport, all of whom also submitted written evidence to me. I'm trying to think. So because this was, half the funding came from government. And actually, one of the reasons the Public Accounts Committee didn't return to the issue was because I was doing the report, because they had got so much on their plate. They thought this would cover it.
When did you send transcripts to the people who gave evidence?
That was done by GLA, the GLA officer.
But you didn't send the transcripts prior to the publication of the report?
Oh yes, I think the individual transcripts were sent to those who'd given evidence where they asked for it. But the actual dates you'll have to get from the GLA.
Can you
admin
remember
office.
any transcripts that you did return to any particular person?
I
Can you
didn't do
remember
it
any particular
myself.
one?
I didn't do it myself. It was done through the GLA admin officer.
There has been a complaint that those transcripts weren't returned despite being
Nobody
being
complained
requested.
to me.
No. Mr. Bellamy, did anybody ask for transcripts from these reports from you?
Not to me personally. There were a number of Freedom of Information requests submitted subsequent to the publication of Dame Margaret's report. where those asked for transcripts, those have been provided, and all those requests have now been met subsequent to officers completing the legal responsibilities they have in terms of checking those with the person who gave evidence, ensuring that they're accurate and contained no information that was inappropriate to publish. And to say that that process, I'm informed, has now been completed, but that was something that's a matter for officers in the usual line of business.
Much as they may not have made personal requests to yourself, did your department receive any requests from people who gave evidence for the transcript of their evidence?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of. Would you think that that's a failing, then, Margaret, if people hadn't received the transcript of their evidence if they'd requested it?
I don't think that anybody was. I mean, who said they asked and were refused?
But
Who asked and was refused?
Would you think it's a failure?
No, it's again another sort of hidden allegation, Andrew. You've got to say, has anybody asked? All I knew was a couple of people asked, could they see their transcripts? And as far as I know, the GLA officer sent them. I don't think there was any problem with that whatsoever.
In the many reports you've been involved with, would you think it a courtesy to allow people who wanted a transcript to have a copy?
Can you tell me who did not get a transcript who asked for it?
That's your question. It's
Well,
ever so simple. Is it
No,
professional
I'm asking
courtesy?
you because behind that question is a sort of assertion that I was trying to hide something. I wasn't. And actually, if you look at how I started all these things, I said, we're going to record this. One or two of you came and talked to me. We're going to record this so there can be no doubt about what was said here. And I opened the conversation that way. So I don't think there was any attempt.
I'm trying to get an idea, then, Margaret, about the standards of report. As you can see, quite openly and transparently in the questions I'm asking about what you consider makes a good report.
No.
And one of those things is perhaps to share the transcripts with
where people ask for them.
When people ask for them.
Well,
And that is a common courtesy, I'm assuming.
I need to know from you, because the implication from what you've said is rather disturbing, that somebody asked for a report, asked for a transcript, and it was refused. So who asked for a transcript and had it
I'm just
refused?
trying to see whether or not this is a
But who did
standard
ask?
by which it shouldn't be dependent upon that.
Andrew, I'm looking.
But
Andrew,
we're
I'm
not
looking.
getting anywhere with this.
Fine. I'm looking around, and Nora, you getting some of your colleagues are
Yes, please.
up in and wanting to come in.
Please.
So let's give you a break, and I'll bring you back.
I've actually
Oh, you finished?
just finished.
Oh, right. Well, thank you.
So,
Right,
thank you.
Sean Berry.
I'm afraid, Chair, I was just going to suggest that we were getting into rather sort of technical and administrative issues, and then we had Lord Harris in here. We didn't challenge his ability to write a report.
Well,
so
I wasn't in the meeting.
can we move on to more interesting things, please?
Caroline, is yours the same, or is there
No, I
a
wanted
question?
to ask David, because this section's about reaction to this review. Did the review change the Mayor's mind? Because if you look back to our first ever Mayor's question time, 25th of May last year, the Mayor at that point said it's quite clear it would cost Londoners more to cancel the Garden Bridge than it would to finish it. And it's therefore in the financial interest of London's taxpayers to complete the Garden Bridge. So the Mayor clearly said that in the 25th of May last year. So did Dame Margaret's report change his mind? Is that the tipping point?
I think there was something in Dame Margaret's report that led to a change of conclusion there. Allow me to explain. What the Mayor said shortly after taking office that you referred to about it being better value for Londoners if the project was completed than cancelled. So if the project were cancelled, at that stage, the government had just agreed to provide a £15 million underwrite for the project. And so if the project were cancelled, we could be looking at a loss of about £52 million to the public purse for no gain. Whereas if the project were to proceed, the net public contribution after the TfL contribution of that £30 million, £20 million changed to become a loan. And so after that loan was repaid, the net public contribution would have been £40 million. And so it was on that basis that the Mayor said that it would be in financial interests of the taxpayer for that project, for the project to continue. What I think then happened in terms of Dave Margaret's expert analysis is not just the general point about the likely further escalation of costs, which Dave Margaret's already referred to in evidence today, but also that we were, her view about the loan to TfL not being likely to be repaid, and in that situation, that clearly changes the net cost of the scheme to the public sector, and that changes the balance of that analysis that the Mayor made.
So it was instrumental in changing the Mayor's mind on this project. Okay, thank you.
Okay, just a very quick one on fundraising. Given the infamous or famous 24-hour visit to San Francisco by GLA people, which I think from Freedom of Information requests, TfL said we're having nothing to do with that, Gov, because you were busy engaged on other activities to do with procurement and other things. So the question to you, Mike, and to Dave Bellamy, can you write to this committee and tell us that your commercial sponsorship departments had nothing to do with fundraising for the Garden Bridge, that you trawl through that is a gap here, and it seems that, and I ask these questions because of the total picture, not just this report, everything else that's come together that paints a picture of the Mayor saying, I want this to happen, and I just, I want to be assured that everything has been done properly and appropriately. You will know, Mike, from your position, one of the accusations from the community, if I can call it that somehow those awarded contracts were also said to be donors for the Ghana Bridge. Now, I'm not suggesting that. I mean, one way to do it is go back into your department, do the word search or whatever you do, and just check and give us a feedback on this committee, because it has been an issue that committee members have raised in private. And if we could do the same within the GLA, we've got the head of paid service here, but I'm asking via the Mayor's Chief of Staff that we want an assurance that was that actually those resources were used either appropriately or we find they were used inappropriately. Please give us an assurance of the latter, hopefully, so we can clear that one up once and for all, and it doesn't go in the myths that there was a little bit more here going on. And I take that in the picture of the fundraising issue about how difficult it is to fundraise for projects like this and where things were travelling from, and a mayoral commitment to the project, which I think is quite clear from the documentation we've received. We'll pick this up in the recommendations at the end. Okay, I want to make some progress, colleagues. So let's go to our next set of questions, which is moving towards cancellation costs. And Tom Copley.
Thank you, Chair. And before, I've got some questions in the run-up to that lead up to the issue of the cancellation costs. Initially, to the Commissioner, on the oversight that TfL had for this project. Now, the principal mechanism TfL had for oversight of this project was its right to attend Garden Bridge Trust board meetings as an observer. Now, there's been a couple of FOIs on this to try and get the minutes. Will Hurst of the Architects Journal put in an FOI in February 2017, which asked for all of the minutes and was told we do not hold minutes from the Garden Bridge Trust board. Now, when a minute was then referenced in a letter from Paul Morell on January 27th, Will Hurst again asked for that one specifically and was told, we did exercise our observer rights, but do not have a centralised record of any copies of minutes that may have been provided to us. Therefore, in order to provide an answer to this, we have conducted a remote search of Richard Decani's TfL mailbox from all emails from the Garden Bridge Trust since 2012 that contain the keyword minutes. And it goes on to say they manually reviewed the minutes to determine whether any of the emails contain minutes from the Garden Bridge Trust board meetings. So my question to you, first of all, is, given that TfL's principal mechanism for overseeing the project and responsibly managing the taxpayers' contribution towards it was observer status at Garden Bridge board meetings, why is TfL unable to provide a complete set of minutes from those meetings in response to FOI requests from the public and indeed questions from the London Assembly?
Well, Well, I don't know the answer to that, Tom, but clearly I'm more than happy to have another look to see whether those minutes are available. I mean, I you know, as far as I'm concerned, we will, as ever, be as transparent and open with any minutes that we have, and we will, of course, respond to any FOI requests as we always do. So, you know, from my perspective, particularly because, of course, when this project started, and for most of its life, I was not involved with it at all because I was running London Underground and not anything to do with the Garden Bridge project. I see no reason why we won't have another look for that, and you know, happy to commit to that.
But isn't this incredibly concerning? Does this concern you? How do you explain the lack of having a centralised record of this information when it was TfL that was charged with overseeing it? I mean, isn't the proper filing of documentation basic good practice when overseeing a grant-funded project of this scale?
Well, I would hope so, and I would expect that under my leadership as Commissioner that would apply.
The most recent minute of the meeting that's been unearthed through this trawl of Richard Dicani's inbox, it's from early 2015. Do you know if at any point TfL or the Garden Bridge Trust made a conscious decision to stop sharing these documents in electronic form, and is a hard copy in existence anywhere, do you know?
Honestly, Tom, I have no information on that whatsoever. I had absolutely no discussion with anyone with regard to the Garden Bridge prior to the day and hour I was asked to cover as acting commissioner. So,
but surely once you came in, you then become responsible for this, and should have been insisting that yes, there was adequate oversight from your, given the scale of public money involved.
Yeah, of course, and that is why I was at pains to assure that any such payments that were made, any such commitments that were made, were in line with the initial funding arrangements and arrangements that had been put in place that predated my arrival as Commissioner. I had no option but to abide with those recommendations, regardless of the fact that I inherited them. But in terms of any discussions about not having sight of those minutes, I had no discussion on that topic ever.
Did you ever ask to see the minutes?
No.
Isn't that a bit odd, given the level of public funding that was involved?
I think if you look at the broad breadth and reach of the job of Transport Commissioner, I was new to the job. There was a whole series of things that I had to commit to within very short order. Actually, I was the acting Commissioner for a period of time before the quite appropriate appointments process took place. And to be honest, I, as all of us do in our working lives, I no doubt was prioritising where I felt the most risk to TfL and the most important things that we were considering at that time were.
But you were aware, of course, that this was a very... It might have been, and I know in your interview with Dame Margaret, we'll come on to this later, you said it wasn't even in your top 100 transport projects. Sure. But you knew it was politically controversial. So wouldn't that have flagged up a red light to you?
I think in retrospect, of course, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, you could say that this has become much more of a politically focused project since then. But at the time of me becoming acting commissioner, the previous mayor was in office. He'd made his position very clear. In effect, the responsibility for the governance of the Garden Bridge project sat with the Garden Bridge Trust, not in the core of TfL's responsibilities, and therefore, I think quite appropriately, of course, the benefit of perfect hindsight always can adjust that view, but at that time I made that the judgment as to where my focus would be.
Mike, when you say political, some of the criticisms of the project were of a technical nature and professional nature that go to the heart of some of the issues. It wasn't just political and people being opposed to the bridge. It was about the processes that TfL were operating on. Do you accept that?
Absolutely, Chair.
You do. So when you say politically, I don't want to.
Absolutely, and
it may have political affiliations.
Absolutely. I don't want to mislead you, Chair, or you, Tom, or the committee. I mean, let me be very clear. I have been absolutely determined to follow the recommendations that have emerged from Dame Margaret's report. Within those recommendations are some issues around the processes of procurement and other factors which we may get to later on in the meeting, I suspect. And I have been very open in saying that absolutely we will put those in place. So one of the first things I did when I took over as Commissioner was set in train a process to have a Chief Procurement Officer put in place across TfL. There had never been a single procurement function across TfL. It was my judgment that along with some other issues. The Garden Bridge experience warranted that as part of the response to those recommendations, and there were many other responses which I suspect we'll get to. So I don't want to give the impression at all, Chair, that this was only about a political consideration, because I have a responsibility as, in effect, the Chief Executive of the organisation, of course.
Do you, as an organisation, did TfL, either through your funding agreement with the Garden Bridge Trust or in any other ways, have the ability to compel them to release all of the minutes from their board meetings?
I don't think we do, but I can check that. But
you certainly have some authority to ask them to do so.
Yes. I mean, again, I'm happy to check on that fact and get back to you formally on that. Yeah.
Dame Margaret, do you think that, from what you've heard here about this lackadaisical approach, perhaps, or hands-off approach, do you think this is symptomatic of a lack of oversight of this project by Transport for London?
I think yes. I completely take. Mike has really instituted some very important reforms, which hopefully, lessons learned, which was one of the purposes. I think there was a lack of oversight all the way through, and it was quite a difficult issue, which I probably never even bottomed out on how decisions were taken to release money through the process.
I'm coming on to that in a moment. Yes.
It seemed to me the authority for that and the scrutiny of that by officials. I mean, I think what's at the heart here? It's this mayoral direction issue. And I think a mayoral, for me, my PAC hat on, a mayoral direction is fine. The mayor should have ideas and should be able to, that's the whole one of the reasons of having a mayor. But it should be a red flag to everybody else. And therefore you ought to be able to, just because he or she has an idea, doesn't mean that you then forget due process. And I think there was a sort of slight muddle in the TfL. I think it comes out of Peter Hendy's evidence to me, actually, that somehow he felt that the mayor had the mandate to do this, with which I agree, because he's got this big democratic mandate. But having, therefore, pursuing a garden bridge was entirely appropriate, but actually forgetting to do due process in the pursuit of a perfectly legitimate objective is not acceptable. And for me, it would have been, so all the internal, you hear all the internal processes within TfL sort of somehow ran away from it because they felt this is a mayoral direction, we've got to go on with it. And that doesn't mean you've still got duties around value for money and probity. You've still got those.
Thank you.
It's a really important lesson to learn.
And I want to come on now to some of these issues around the signing of the engineering contracts specifically, because TfL did have an absolute role there in terms of authorising the release of the next tranche of funding. And there's always been some confusion around this issue, not least because the language of a mayoral direction needed to be altered at one point. But I've got to ask Mike, first of all, there are a number of conditions in the deed of grant that needed to be satisfied to TfL satisfaction. So I'm going to go through a couple of them. Could you explain to us how the Garden Bridge Trust satisfied you, and I quote, that it had secured a satisfactory level of funding to operate and maintain the Garden Bridge once it is built for at least the first 5 years of operation?
So if I can the fact that there was a series of payments that took place since I took over as Commissioner. Those are the only payments that I can talk about with any certainty to this committee.
And this was under your time as
I was advised, for example, the 10th of August 2015, there was a payment of 1.74 million. That payment, which we made DFT aware of, I was advised that was in accordance with the schedule of the funding agreement, and had we not made that payment, then we would have been in breach of the funding agreement as had been laid out previously. And that actually is the case for all the subsequent payments, so 3.5 million on the 16th of November.
But I really want to focus on this £7 million payment that was released after the construction contract was signed.
Yeah.
I want you to tell me how the Garden Bridge Trust satisfied you that they had secured a satisfactory level of funding to operate and maintain the garden bridge once it is built for at least the first 5 years of operation.
Well, that was, can you just remind me of the date of that, Tom?
The £7 million was released in February, March 2016.
Right, okay. So, again, my advice at that time, and by the way, this was also when, of course, our own Audit and Assurance Committee was undergoing a review of the funding of this, and my advice was quite clear that we were obliged to pay that money at that time. Actually, when we got to the funding, of the 22nd of April, there was a mayoral direction, 1647 signed, which amended the precondition for the GLA guarantees of the bridge. So instead of needing 5 years of operating costs at that point, that then said that the Garden Bridge Trust now needed to demonstrate a credible strategy for securing those funds going
But the
forward.
deed of grant was never amended, sorry.
That was not an approval that TfL needed to give at that time. That was not something that required our approval and didn't get our approval.
Can I just come in? So I've seen exchange between TfL officials and Department of Transport officials to draw down their money, and it just says there's no due diligence report attached to it, no additional information. It just says the conditions have been met. Is that what you received in terms of the assurances you got, or is there in TfL behind every one of these decisions? I'm more interested, I know the 7 million is an interesting one, the construction contract. Is there a due diligence piece of work on that reconciles that all the conditions have been met?
I can't recall seeing that.
I don't think it exists.
Yeah, I can't recall seeing that, Chair.
So can you come back to this committee and tell us, because I don't believe that due diligence has been done. Because I've yet to, because I think you would have disclosed that either to the independent inquiry and the information you've given. Looking at the transcripts, it appears that everyone's sort of it's edging around that, and we're relying on an official telling us that it has when it clearly hasn't.
Well, of course, I'm happy to do that, Chair, and I will just emphasise again that actually, there is no way that under my watch, and it goes back to the recommendations that I've accepted from Margaret's report, there is no way that I would have set up an arrangement that led us down this path. I just want to be very clear about that, because this is, clearly what I'm happy to share with you, of course, if there is anything there.
Well, I'm very clear, because it's quite a serious matter, isn't it, about giving money over when the conditions clearly haven't been met. Right? So in terms of that, throughout this project, I think there are questions in terms of drawdowning money, but we can pinpoint at specific times when actually red flags or someone should have been there. The risk, and highlighting the risk about those that have been signed off before we give that money across. It appears none of that has happened, either within TfL, or I can't find anything in the GLA. I'm going to ask some questions in the GLA in a minute about what they did with mayoral directions, but even so, is that...
Well, I do understand, and I think that, again, going back, and I know I'm verging into the recommendations, Chair, but so forgive me, but I think it is relevant in this context. So the way that the Mayor and I fully supported and endorsed the approach to ensure much greater transparency of mayoral directions coming forward in terms of the TfL board, which is there to fulfil that function going forward, the way that we've reconstituted since the current Mayor has been elected, a Programmes and Investment Committee rather than the very wide-reaching Finance and Policy Committee, which covered investment matters as well as core finance matters. All of that actually leads to much greater oversight and scrutiny, including, I think very helpfully, actually decisions that are devolved to the role of the Commissioner that actually have to be reported properly and in full to the Programme and Investment Committee. So I think there are some, now it may be, in retrospect after this project has happened that has occurred, but I do want to emphasise to you, Chair, and through the committee that is absolutely appropriate, and that is something that I've fully supported.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. That's okay, Chair. I'm still. I don't think you've explained to me. I know you mentioned this mayoral direction. There was a mayoral direction which softened the language to say, I think, had a satisfactory funding strategy. Yes. But the deed of grant was never amended. The deed of grant it had the stronger version, which was secured satisfactory level of funding. You still haven't explained, and I know this is a decision that this was I think this was done by Richard DeCowney when he was Managing Director of Planning, but presumably the buck stops with you and you would have had to sign this off. So I want to know from you how they satisfied you that they could operate and maintain the Garden Bridge for at least the first 5 years of operation.
Well, I don't think I did sign it off, actually, because I think in the way that this was constructed, that was not required under the arrangement that existed at that time. And that kind of is my point, Tom, that is precisely why tightening up those arrangements under my leadership and under my watch is so important. I don't believe that was the original way this was set up, and I think that's regrettable.
So if I ask you then, looking at it now, are you satisfied? I mean, are you satisfied that they did have a satisfactory level of funding to operate and maintain the Garden Bridge for at least the first 5 years?
I was very clear when, if I cast forward to when the current mayor took office, I was very clear that no such further payments should be made to the Garden Bridge, other than those that were within line with the funding requirements that we had to deliver within the original agreement. And there was no other payments made after that time. And
yes, but you didn't have to release the £7 million if you were not satisfied that these conditions had been met. There was no obligation on you to do so. Well, a decision
was clearly made that there was satisfaction to that. And I would only say to you that that is precisely why tightening up of those processes has been so important to me.
Who made that decision? If it wasn't you, who made it?
Well, I mean, there is an executive team that sits within TfL, and there are.
So who's on that?
There are devolved. I could share with you the devolved funding approvals that exist. I mean, when you're in an organisation, as you very well know, Caroline, from your time on the Transport Committee, there are multi-billion-pound projects that have particular approval paths that go from people around my table with devolved accountability for certain levels of expenditure right up to those that require formal board approval. That has always been the case. Clearly, the transparency and the process by which those decisions are made has been enhanced and tightened up in response
on
to
this
these.
one, who did it? Maybe you can write to us which board it was and who sat on it at the time and any minutes for it.
I'm very happy to do so, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, that would be helpful. Given that, the mayoral guarantee of the running cost, the British running cost, was never signed. Looking now at Martin Clark, it was never signed. So why did TfL allow the release of this money upon the signing of the construction contract, given they didn't have that guarantee of 5 years?
Well, our understanding was that we were obliged to release that funding at that time. That is my understanding.
But what confuses me is that you weren't obliged because you were able to accept that that the Garden Bridge Trust had to meet a certain set of conditions as set out in the deed of grant.
Yeah.
So you weren't obliged. You were able to, but you were also able to go to the Garden Bridge Trust and say, well, I'm sorry, you haven't satisfied us of these conditions. Yeah,
well, look, I'm very happy to share with you the basis on which those decisions were made. And I just don't have that immediately in front of me, Tom, the basis for that decision, but I'm more than happy to, of course, share that with you. No problem with that.
I'll try this next question. You might not be able to answer this either. How did TfL satisfy itself in January and February 2016 that the Garden Bridge Trust's business plan was credible?
Again, I will write to you through the chair about the process by which that decision was made, because I just can't recall at this moment in time how that decision was come to and who made it.
Okay. Well, one of the main reasons given by the mayor for withdrawing the offer of a mayoral guarantee was a lack of belief in the trust business plan. Do you now agree or disagree with that assessment?
I think it's become apparent, as Dame Margaret referred to in the answer to her earlier question, where the funding that had originally been seen to exist from the private sector contribution had reduced significantly, even in advance of her report. I think it had become very questionable as to whether the Garden Bridge Trust could raise the necessary funding to satisfy what they needed to satisfy.
I will read you now a part of your exchange with Margaret Hodge during her interview, and this is in relation to the release of this £7 million. And actually the question about whether you're obliged to do so or not, because in that transcript there's some confusion, and I think you have to correct yourself at one point, or be corrected by another TfL officer. So Dame Margaret says, but you say they, the Garden Bridge Trust, informed you. Why the hell didn't you write them a letter back saying, this is unwise at this point? They may inform you. There is nothing from you that says, hang on a minute, don't, this is a bit risky committing us. And you say, well, yes, in retrospect, such a letter might have been a good thing to happen. I think the reality was, where the very overt political direction at that time was very much in support of the Garden Bridge. So Dame Margaret then interjects and says, so nobody would have dared write a letter. And you reply, well, the mayor is my boss, whoever the mayor is, being honest. Were you just doing what the mayor told you to do?
I think that I have a responsibility to challenge a mayor when I consider it to be appropriate to do so, but I think it is quite clear that there was as indeed has been alluded earlier on, there was a very clear personal commitment to this bridge from the previous mayor.
But you still had a responsibility,
I
a responsibility to act in the public interest.
Absolutely a responsibility to act in the public interest, and had I, again, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe I should have challenged at that point in time, but...
There's an awful lot of hindsight in this meeting.
Well, at that moment, I didn't see it was appropriate to do so, but with the benefit of perfect hindsight, which again is why I think having these proper checks and balances in place is so important going forward. And I think that's where the governance arrangements and the sign-off arrangements and the transparency of such approvals for funding commitment that do not happen is so important.
I think the public also want people to be held accountable for what happened at the time. And obviously the former mayor's gone, the former deputy mayor for transport's moved on, the former managing director of planning has moved on. And I think there's a feeling that no one is being held accountable for this. I mean, Dame Margaret, do you think it is odd or unacceptable that someone, TfL, GLA, wherever, has not really been held accountable, has not been disciplined for anything in relation to this project?
Goodness. I mean, interesting enough, I'm always reluctant on this, but I really do deeply regret that Boris Johnson didn't come and talk to me. And what was clear from, so I could never challenge, what other people said about his role, and he never had a chance to explain himself in relation to it. But it's one of those instances where, I said it at the beginning, he clearly was completely committed. I mean, it's political cycles, isn't it? You've got an electoral cycle. Time and time again in the evidence, people talked about this was a second-term deliverable. That was how it was seen in the organisation. You get, him and his deputy mayor for transport ringing up officials involved all the time. So I think he ought to.
Well, she claims she has nothing to do with it or something like that, I believe. But.
Yeah, he ought to be. He ought to explain himself. Why? It's not so much the idea. I keep saying this. It's not the idea. It was the due process. It's due process. It's nothing to do. The idea is perfectly legitimate and fine. You may agree, disagree. That's not the issue.
I want to move on to another point, which is to do with the engineering contract and relationship between TfL and Arab. And there's some.
Should we bring that under?
We'll bring it up later. We'll bring it under. Okay. In that case, I'll move on to the questions here on the cancellation costs. Yes. So to Dame Margaret, first of all, what evidence did you receive during the review as to how the initial pre-construction funds had been spent? I mean, were they spent on trees, design, advice, public consultations?
I didn't receive a greater breakdown than I got from TfL, and I didn't seek that.
You didn't seek it?
No.
Do you think it would be helpful for the public to know in more detail exactly where some of this money has gone?
Well, I would hope now that the project, the Garden Bridge Trust have decided not to proceed with the project. They will be completely open with the way that they and TfL prior to that spent the money. Absolutely. It's public money.
David, is that something that you would expect from the Garden Bridge Trust now? Are you going to be seeking that they are very, very open with this information?
Absolutely. I mean, I understand that the Trust Chair has committed to publishing full details of where the money went. Obviously, a great number of people will be interested to see that. If they choose not to, then clearly we'll have to explore what powers TfL may have through the wind-up process that's currently underway in order to bring as much transparency to this as we're able to.
Thank you. To the Commissioner now, what's the status of TfL's loan to the Garden Bridge Trust?
So at the moment we are waiting to hear back from the Garden Bridge Trust as to how much of that loan may be able to be returned to us. Clearly my objective is to secure as much return to the public purse as we can, and we wait to hear from the Garden Bridge Trust, having written to them to that effect.
Will any of the Garden Bridge trustees, will the Garden Bridge trustees be personally liable for any of this money?
I'm not aware of the legal detail. Forgive me on that, Tom. I genuinely don't know that point.
Okay. Once
Sorry.
so
So
yes.
in terms of that, there's approaches on this, isn't it? So we can either work to Greenwich Mean Time or we can work to some other form of time. Is there a sense of urgency from you both about seeking to get back those public monies from a cancelled project?
Yes, there is. I mean,
There
not,
is.
not least, Chair, because clearly what I want to ensure is that that there is no reduction in the money that might be available to be paid back to us because a longer time frame prevails. So
I just
absolutely.
wanted to understand the
Yeah.
sense of urgency.
It is
around
absolutely
it.
very urgent.
Okay,
Yeah.
that you're on it and you're
Yeah.
on the case.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. Once TfL had handed over control to the Garden Bridge Trust in 2015, what controls did you have over how it spent public funding before construction?
We didn't really. I mean, there was some other funding that we had to. There was some work that we had to do. So, for example, on the as the Highways Authority, clearly we had to do some work, and there's issues around Temple Station that we had to do. But in terms of the core amount of the money, because the responsibilities were with the trust for how that spending was executed, that was their responsibility.
And do you think, compared with other projects, was the amount of money spent during the pre-construction period unusually high?
I think it's difficult to compare it to other projects because I've never seen any project quite like this.
I don't think any of us have.
You can put it in a more different way.
Do you think it would have been different had this project been managed directly by TfL?
Yes.
Interesting. What have you learned as a result of your experience with the Garden Bridge Trust? Would you repeat this structure in future?
Absolutely not. I think I didn't start that structure in the first instance, and I think there's a huge amount of learnings and how you should be very cautious about relying on a charitable trust and charitable donations, private sector donations. I think it's perfectly appropriate, by the way, to work in tandem between the private and public sector for big iconic projects. I don't think that's the issue at hand here, but I think the level of controls and the level of assurance as to how public money is spent is absolutely an imperative. So absolutely, and again, I think our response to the recommendations made by Dame Margaret evidence that too.
Okay, thank you. And I've got some further questions I'll bring up later.
And later on. Right, I've seen Caroline Pigeon and Andrew Boff.
Mike, do you accept that some of the cancellation costs we're going to face are as a result of TfL's lack of processes by, for example, allowing Garden Bridge Trust to sign a £105 million construction contract and the like when not everything was in place?
I think the difficulty goes right back to the original funding agreement with them. I think had we had still been able to control how they spent their money at that point, well, yes, but I think the reality was that the control being with the Garden Bridge Trust, they were responsible from a governance perspective of how that money was spent, not TfL.
TfL effectively created the Garden Bridge Trust.
Well, effectively, but I can't comment on how that happened or why that happened because I wasn't there.
But how it was set up is partly TfL's responsibility. You set up this structure, it clearly hasn't worked, and there's going to be huge costs to the taxpayer as a result. So do you accept TfL has some responsibility?
I accept that TfL has responsibility, absolutely, and I wasn't the commissioner at the time, I wasn't nothing to do with it at the time.
Is your duty as commissioner to the mayor, as you put in your transcript from Dame Margaret, the mayor is my boss, whoever the mayor is being honest, or is it to the taxpayer?
I think I have multiple responsibilities. I'm held accountable to the mayor, to the Transport for London board, which clearly exists, and subject to scrutiny as part of the mayoral family to London Assembly as part of this afternoon. So I think there's a multiple series of stakeholders that I interact with at all times.
But I think in this case, and since you have become acting commissioner and commissioner, should you not have looked at this in greater detail and thought about the taxpayer rather than the mayor and the mayor's direction?
I think in retrospect, Caroline, as I tried to say to Tom and through the chair as well, I think in retrospect you could assume all of that. I had 24 hours notice to take over the role of acting commissioner, and there then was a process to fill that job transparently and openly, as I consider it, a few months later, and clearly there was a huge learning curve and sense of priorities that I had to get to grips with, and I made a judgment to focus on those of the highest spend and what I considered to be the highest importance to London taxpayers and fare payers as to what was going on at that moment in time. Now, as ever, I'm more than happy to accept as a human being that sometimes in retrospect you would judge things differently than I did at the time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Andrew.
Mr. Bellamy, what undertakings did you give to the Garden Bridge Trust that the mayor that they had the mayor's support?
Nothing beyond the mayor's public statements.
So you didn't say to them that it's all right, you know, that the mayor is behind you or anything like that?
No.
Thank you. And Mr. Brown, how do you take the comments of your predecessor who reckoned the business case for the Garden Bridge was pretty similar to the business case for the Rotherhithe Bridge?
I can't comment on what my predecessor's views are.
Okay. But you presumably you would say that the Rotherhithe Bridge business case is more sound than the Garden Bridge. Is that correct? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I think the Rotherhithe business case, given the challenges of interchanging at Canada Water and the need to improve pedestrian and cycling access to the Isle of Dogs from Canada Water, is a very obviously important transport project.
Okay. But the quote precisely from Peter Hendy is, well, the business case for the pedestrian bridge in Canary Wharf to Rotherhithe isn't much cop, if I remember rightly. And then goes on to say it's a similar case. So.
Well, with respect, Sir Peter Hendy has been the Commissioner for 2.5 years, and clearly the detailed analysis is, I'm sure, quite different than it might have been when he last looked at it.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Joan McCarthy, before we move on to the next set of questions, Joan.
And at that point, I don't know if it's to Michael, to Dame Margaret, but I understand the initial business case in July 2014 was reviewed by the Treasury on behalf of the Public Accounts Committee subsequently. And they came to a very different view of the TfL's original business case, and I believe they said that the transport benefits were actually marginal. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. The Public Accounts Committee let me have that analysis that they'd asked for, and they were very sceptical of the business case. In fact, one of the arguments around should it or should it not continue was it would have required a new business case. I think everybody would have done a new business case, and I think probably the transport benefits were highly marginal. I thought they were highly marginal in the 2014 case. And the dependence in the business case on uplift in land values was also very questionable. If you look at it today, it just wouldn't be there.
Thank you.
I just want to go back to an earlier part of the conversation, Mike. So when we were signing off all this money and the due diligence process, or the lack of a due diligence process, we have a Treasury report in the background, and NEO reports
the Treasury report was the Treasury redoing of the business case was after
the monies. We certainly had NAO concerns around on it, and I just want you, when you come back to this committee, to think about what they were and where were they reported to, either in TfL organisation or to senior management at any time. and about the risk of this project and what people will sign off before we give in the money over.
Yeah, of course I'll do that, Chair. Yeah.
Okay, Sean.
Yeah, just following on there from the previous question about the transport case, essentially. I, as you probably know, I've been a transport campaigner for some time. I'm quite familiar with transport business cases, and obviously incredibly aware of how difficult it is often to justify walking and cycling schemes in terms of how often car journeys and time savings for car journeys overwhelm the case for cycling and walking schemes. So it was very surprising to me to find, when I was running for mayor and looking through some of the papers that have come out of the review, that this had a solid transport business case. But to the Commissioner, you came to see this committee in December 2015, and you did reassure the committee that there was a transport business case. But the transcripts to the review, they do show that you more or less admit that that wasn't the strongest part of the business case. You said, and I think somebody on Copley quoted you before, if we were looking at the transport projects that we could fund, this would not be in my top 100. So can I ask you to comment on that? Was there politics behind the original transport case? And to what extent you would stand by it if you had to look at that project again?
Well,
I know you sort of inherited it, but you offered assurances.
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's a very reasonable question. I think. Look, any improved crossing over the Thames, whether it's actually in the east of London or whether it's in any part of London, clearly has some marginal benefit in terms of improving access between the two halves, the two sides of the river. And I think that was the point I probably didn't very eloquently make in front of that December 2015 meeting. But in a sense, that is true. It doesn't mean that it is anything like of the same imperative as, for example, putting new signals on the Circle line and increasing capacity on those lines by 55%, or about improving bus prioritisation or improving walking and cycling and healthy streets more generally. It doesn't compare to any of those at all, nor does it indeed compare, as I've just answered to the previous question, to the benefits I think you get from the Canada Water to Isle of Dogs British Brotherhood bridge. I don't think it does. But I think, the context in which I was making the statement was, does it have, it was a general discussion about transport benefits. To say there was none wouldn't have been correct, because clearly it opened up an opportunity for some people to walk across the river who might not have otherwise done so. But in the greater scheme of transport projects around the city, projected for the city, it was nowhere near a top priority.
And yet it was able to pull down money from TfL and the Treasury for transport reasons. Can I ask Dame Margaret to comment on that as well? Do you think it would have been more honest, is that one of the conclusions that you draw, to have emphasised other aspects of it and to compare those benefits with some of the harms that it would do to things like trees if you're making a judgment?
I mean, my first thing, lesson learned, be clear about what you're doing and why. And if this could, a garden bridge could be an iconic, fantastic tourist attraction. It could be. Whether it was in the right place is not you can argue about that, but it could be. If we'd had that, I think the whole business case would have been different. And we might be in a very different place today. I mean, my suspicion, of course, is, knowing the finances of this place, TfL is a route towards money. So it was, and you might think about that. I mean, I didn't really address that in my review, but it's because TfL has that money around. If you've got a brand new idea, that maybe they try to get it dressed up as a transport, bit of transport infrastructure, which I think most of the business case reviews now suggest they were marginal. The Treasury one, the most recent Treasury one, says that.
I found that incredibly frustrating. I think the word "dressed up" as a transport project is a really, really good phrase. The other quite non-standard part of the business case, the case for spending public money, was the fact that it was such a sort of heavily heavily dependent on other contributions, on private contributions, and particularly philanthropic contributions, for which the people making the contribution were not going to make a profit. So there's a question there. Again, that the Treasury money came in to that, and they've got quite strict rules about things like the management case, the financial case, and whether or not the rest of the money might come in, whether the project's viable. You've made presumably some recommendations to the Treasury Department that signed it off, or to the DFT?
I didn't do those in detail because the Public Accounts Committee had sort of...
But you said they weren't looking at it because you were doing this review.
No,
so are you going to
but
feed back in
they
through
had
them?
one. I could do. I mean, they had one review, which looked at the Department of Transport contribution, which is their remit, in which they suggested, I think that was, I mean, again, I haven't looked at this for a few months, so apologies if I'm not in 100% accurate, but in which it was suggested that the business case was not very strong. I think, to be honest, the Treasury business case review, I think would, even if none of this had happened, I just wonder what Treasury's position would be under the new Conservative government. Whether, I mean, I haven't had any conversations, I haven't got any inside knowledge, but I think if Philip Hammond and others look at that Treasury business case review in the current climate of public expenditure, they would have question marks over it. That would be my reading of it.
So arguably the reason that the project's collapsed now is not to do with the fact that the transport case disappeared, or those were not the reasons that it collapsed. It was because the other side of the money, the trust themselves say they can't raise the other side of the money. So is that something that everyone in general, particularly TfL, are going to, that kind of project where a small amount of money is going against money that's quite speculative, is there going to be very sceptical view taken of any subsequent projects in the future? Will there be new rules about the risk of accompanying money?
Absolutely. I think there is. I would not enter into this sort of arrangement ever again. In this way, it's clearly something that clearly something you look back at and you say that given what emerged, that is not what you would wish to do. As I say, I do just want to emphasise, though, that is not the same as saying you would never enter into projects that had some private sector funding, but it's the mechanism by which you have certainty of that funding prior to committing public sector funds alongside it. I think I just want to emphasise that point, Chair, through you, if I may, because it's an important point to make.
Yeah, that's the point. If you have a project where you've got different sources of funding, the certainty surrounding each part of that funding has to be good before you put the public money in. Absolutely. And it seems in this case this was not. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, Peter, then I'll take Tom, and then we're going to come back to Peter for his next set of questions.
Margaret, I wondered, we talked about this sort of being a controversial project, and the impression I have is that there was a point at which public support went. But I just wondered, have you got any comments on the state of the general public opinion when it actually was initiated? I mean, was there a great public support for it or demand? I mean, maybe your review didn't go that far, but are we to be convinced that there was a great groundswell of support for this thing in the first place?
Remember, I wasn't looking at whether this was a good idea or not,
Yeah.
although I do think if this project had huge public support, it would have been much easier to raise the philanthropic. So to that extent, my interest was whether or not they would raise the philanthropic monies. The Trust themselves claimed that they had great public support from a survey, a poll they did, I know it's Murray, I shouldn't say that, in 2014, where they claimed that 87% of people supported the bridge. I think I did look a little bit at that in detail, and I think there were 6 questions on the survey, of which 3 were about who were you, identity questions. There were 3 about the actual bridge, one of which said, what do you like or dislike about it, and what would you do differently? So it wasn't what I would, and I have a background in this, so I actually worked in this area. It wasn't what I would call rigorous, an approach. what was interesting is in the course of talking to people, I mean, I talked to, 2 people sitting around the table, 3 people sitting around the table today, 4, I think. Wait a minute, I'm trying to work out, I can't remember. But I talked to a lot of local councillors, local MPs, GLA councillors who are leaders in their community, who talk quite, to me, convincingly about the response they were getting in various, whether it was surveys, whether it was in their inbox, whether it was, in that way. And my feeling on this was that, if somebody says to you, we're going to have a garden bridge, it sounds like a lovely idea. And then I think as the detail emerged and the extent of public expenditure commitment emerged, I think that's when confidence in the concept started to decline. And, particularly, for example, which is why I said at the beginning, if I had been the Garden Bridge Trust, I would have put a huge amount of effort into ensuring that there was support for this concept all the way. It's really important for the philanthropic giving. It's really important, not just an end in itself. So don't look up at the Treasury or the Mayor. Look at the people in whose interest the People's Bridge. I mean, Joanna Lumley called it the People's Bridge, and I just felt people were up that way, not down that way. So I think my discussions with the elected groups and with some of the suggested to me that what had started as sort of vaguely positive, and actually Coin Street was similar. Coin Street similarly felt at the beginning, great idea. And it was only when they started consulting with their population that began to emerge, and people were thinking, hang on a minute, I'm not sure we like this. And certainly on the Lambeth side, where there have been cuts by the local council to investment in their open spaces, I think it was particularly difficult there in terms of acceptance by the local population. So I think probably it started off people thinking, okay, I'm a bit of an iffy survey, but let's take that. And then I don't think there was sufficient effort by the Garden Bridge Trust to maintain that confidence in the concept. And then the evidence I got from particularly locally elected politicians and pressure groups was that it disintegrated.
I see. But the original poll that you mentioned, the only one really,
Yeah.
was more or less not saying, do you want one or not? It was more or less saying, you're going to get one, what do you want it to be like?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
They don't need to come in, actually. It's
Fine.
It's fine.
Peter, do you want to continue on with some formal questions about the senior staff and the revolving doors into the private sector?
Yes, thank you. This is, as Nancy says, about the movement of staff. Dame Margaret, I want to start by asking you what your main concerns about the movement of senior staff between public bodies and private sectors. What the private sector, what are your main concerns? I mean, as I understand it in your review, in the case of 2 quite senior staff who went out, you saw no problem with that. There was,
I saw no evidence.
Yeah. Can you sort of explain why you came to that decision particularly?
Well, to be absolutely honest with you, I mean, this is an issue which I have had concern over time with the Public Accounts Committee. Very often you looked at defence contracts, you looked at transport and infrastructure contracts, you looked at employment service. I mean, I can think of a lot, health service. There are whole areas where there is a revolving door syndrome, which I find may not be in the public interest. So it's been an issue that has been around for some time, and this is absolutely no criticism of either the company or the 2 individuals. But if 2 individuals who were closely involved in the letting and running of a contract then go off and work that, in terms of public confidence in that as an appropriate pattern of behaviour, I have a question mark. And it's not just here, it's elsewhere. So my own view is twofold, and I know it's really hard. So, if you're in the private sector, you get a quarantine period quite often when you move from one job to another, and I think that would be one thing that I would investigate. Maybe difficulties with it, but and it's, you know, there are difficulties around enforcement, but I would look at that. And the other system that we have in central government, which I think is okay, it's not brilliant, is that there is a committee that looks at if people move from either working or actually politicians, if you're a minister or you're
Is it COBRA you're talking about?
Pardon?
A COBRA you're talking about?
No, it's not called COBRA, it's called the committee, I can't remember.
No, ACOBA. It's
ACOBA.
Advisory
Oh,
Committee
ACOBA.
on Business
Right,
Appointments.
sorry, I thought COBRA. No.
No. I'm not that off.
No, sorry, I misheard that. Right, well, they look at it and they say whether it's an acceptable move or not. And I think a mechanism like that, and it's not impugning anything against anybody here, but I just think in terms of the public interest and public perceptions, it's very, very important to have transparency around this. And I think a quarantine period is a really good private sector convention which the public sector should look at and perhaps adopt.
But in the case of the two individuals that are mentioned in this report, you saw no suspicion there, you had no reason
I
to.
saw absolutely no evidence.
And how did you come to that conclusion? Sorry, I mean, how purely on statements from...
Statements, and I got absolutely no written evidence at all that's suggesting. I didn't dig around massively around it, but I certainly questioned them both on it. And I also got correspondence from from Arabs.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brown, what, if any, restrictions are placed on senior TfL staff in moving to the private sector as it stands?
Well, we don't place restrictions other than for people who have left under a severance agreement. So we haven't characteristically done that because clearly until somebody resigns and then is moving on, you don't know where they're going to go or what's going to happen. But however, I would just say that I know that across the GLA we are now looking at the types of things that Dame Margaret refers to as what we might do to more rigorously pursue this, and I absolutely commit to playing a full part of that. I'm delighted to say that across the GLA we've now got a new Human Resources Director who actually has got some experience, as I understand it, David, in the National Audit Office, and therefore will play a role in carrying out a review of how we do this, and I will absolutely commit to ensuring that TfL is fully playing a part in that review and supporting whatever way we can and complying with whatever emerges from that.
Well, I mean, will you face any particular problems if the conditions are made more restrictive?
Well, I won't face any challenges I don't think as TfL. I mean, I think the only thing we have to make sure is we're obviously, it goes without saying, on the right side of the law, because I know there are some legal processes that we have to follow to make sure we're not restricting somebody's individual freedoms and all that kind of stuff. So we will, of course, make sure we're complying with best practice as determined by this review by the GLA, which we'll be happy to follow the advice of, and ensuring that we do things as best industry practice we should do.
Thank you. David, do you think the rules should be tightened? If so, would this be something that would apply across the whole of the GLA family?
I think the place to start is that the Mayor does support Dame Margaret's recommendation, and for the reasons Dame Margaret set out, it's important that there isn't a perception formed that private firms can gain advantage in a procurement process or another similar process through recruiting somebody who was involved in that work here at the GLA or in one of the functional bodies. And so the question then becomes one of how we proceed there. Something we've taken legal advice on. What essentially you're looking at is probably two options. One is a restrictive covenant in people's contract of employment, which basically restricts their ability to carry out their trade when they cease being employed by the GLA or functional body. There are one or two examples of those used in use around the group, but I know this from my private sector experience before coming here, they can be very difficult to enforce, and that if their purpose effectively deprives the individual of their ability to make a living in their field, then the court is just likely to throw them out, and that's just creating more legal cost and burdens for ourselves as an authority, which is not actually helping anybody. The civil services you touched on earlier have business appointment rules in this regard. I think the legal basis on which those operate is slightly different, and the National Audit Office this summer criticised how those were being implemented and carried out, and so there's clearly some learning to draw there. And as Mike said, it's great that the GLA now has a new assistant director for HR who comes from the Cabinet Office and can just help us work closely with the Cabinet Office and try and draw those lessons. The other thing that is a possible approach that Margaret mentioned is the idea of a quarantine period when somebody tenders their notice. That obviously has an advantage in that you know they're not starting at a new employer, and they're not thus passing things on or whatever it may be. The downside, of course, with that is that it's an expenditure of public funds to pay somebody to do nothing. And you can see how that can create negative perceptions as well. So this isn't an easy one to solve at all. Now that Charmaine is on board, we will be picking up this recommendation again and trying to work out the best way to thread through these things. In the meantime, it probably is worth saying, certainly for the GLA, and I'm sure it's true in all the functional bodies as well, that contracts of employment do contain confidentiality clauses which persist after people's employment here, and that provides some degree of protection, reassurance in terms of how people behave when they move on from the organisation.
I see. You mentioned public money, they're being given to people for doing nothing effectively. This is not really part of my questioning here, but I'm not going to get the chance to ask you again. And I mean, the thing is that what people are asking me, what members of the public and people who come to the Assembly members ask me more than anything, is that the money that we've lost, the 50 million or whatever, we're not going to get back. They want to know, where did it go? What was it basically? How was it distributed? Who got it? I mean, they know they're not going to get it back. And I know this is not really in our remit today, but I just wondered if you could give them any guidance as to where the 50 million went. Was it on consultancy fees? Was it on feasibility studies? What was it on?
So what we expect we're looking at is the expenditure to date has been £37.4 million. On top of that, the Department for Transport decided to underwrite the project in May 2016, without which, had they not issued that, the project would have gone no further. Initially, that underwriting was for £15 million, but then after a change of Secretary of State, it was scaled back to £9 million. And the committee, of course, will be aware, per Dame Margaret's report, that was only done after a letter of direction was issued to the DFT accounting officer to overrule his advice in the matter. So what that additional £9 million is what at the moment the Garden Bridge Trust are putting together a claim for to TfL, who act as the administrators of the DFT funding for the scheme. And TfL, the Commission has been clear that we'll only be paying out any of that money where we're legally obliged to do so. And the way that works is it's not about the Trust drip feeding through individual payment requests. They have to pull everything together and make one single declaration and bid. And so obviously that's taken them some time to do, and we all await that to bring this to a close. I understand that the chair of the Garden Bridge Trust has committed to publishing full details of where their money was spent. Beyond that,
when will we get that, David? Sorry, when?
That's a matter for the Garden Bridge Trust. Okay. But I think from our side, through the wind-up process and the administration that TfL has to do, and the check-in to ensure that DFT money that will be paid out is only paid out where it absolutely has to be. We will see what information we're able to gather and obtain, and then we will obviously look to make that public, because I think you're absolutely right that the people of London do want an answer to that question.
Okay, let's move on. We're on the last set of formal questions. Oh, sorry.
I was going to come in.
You were going to
Yes,
come in this one?
Yes, I think it's best to bring it in under this section.
The first question on procurement.
Sorry. No, I was going to bring it as a follow-up to Peter's, not on section 6. I've been passed some emails that were released as a result of an FOI by the Architects Journal in relationship to contact between ARUP and TfL officers regarding the engineering contract. Now, according to TfL's auditors in the report that they published, ARUP claimed that at the bidding stage they weren't involved with Thomas Heatherwick Studios. Now, the tender for the bid was launched in April 2013. However, a couple of months before then, in January 2013, the former managing director of planning at TfL wrote to Duncan Wilkinson, who is a part of ARUP's infrastructure design team, and this is all in the FOI, which has been released. Garden Bridge across the Thames, Heatherwick and Lumley, ring any bells? Apparently ARUP are involved with Mace. To which Wilkinson responded, yes, it does ring bells. Thomas Heatherwick is apparently the man of the hour. My bridge colleagues are helping our building practice who work with Heatherwick. I can let you have my views when we meet, or we can speak on the phone. To which the former managing director of planning replies, he has met with the mayor and Peter Hendy, and we're potentially going to be doing some work to take this forward as a mayoral project. So at some point, a contact and discussion with ARUP would be good. That doesn't really tally with a claim that ARUP were not involved with Thomas Heatherwick, does it, Mike?
Well, I think the key lesson going forward for this is that we need to have much greater transparency and records of all conversations that have taken place.
Of course, it goes back to the point about people wanting, and this is part of our job on the Assembly, accountability for what has happened. Not,
sure.
We obviously want
Yeah.
this process to change going forward. But, I mean, do you think this undermines TfL's own audit if the information they were given about potential contacts with Thomas Heatherwick and ARUP were not properly declared?
I think clearly that is precisely why we need to have all these interactions and conversations properly documented, which I fully support and endorse. And I think, that going forward, I want to make sure that our experts in the now single commercial team we've got, and indeed the legal team, feel that they've got absolute right to escalate and bring to the attention of me or my executive committee or anybody else in the chain of command issues that are of concern to them in not following due process in any procurement matter. So absolutely we've got to get this better going forward, and that's precisely why I've changed the procurement processes since I've been doing this job, exactly for those reasons.
The contract between TfL and ARUP was signed on the 8th of July 2013. Now, during the bidding process, TfL's rules were very clear that contact between anyone at ARUP and TfL was only permitted via one officer, who I won't name, but is named in the tendering. That's the only contact that's permitted, and that contact with Heatherwick Studio is also not permitted. Now, ARUP were interviewed on the 16th of May. The contract wasn't signed until the 8th of July, but there are a number of emails that have been released between people at ARUP and TfL staff, including the former managing director of planning, before the contract was signed. Does that concern you?
Well, that's precisely, again, why I want to see some transparency. Now, of course, there sometimes will be, just to be clear, there sometimes will be interaction between bidders on a consistent basis, various bidders, as part of a normal procurement process. That's standard practice in any.
But that's by the named person.
Yeah,
These are contacts by the person who isn't named.
Yeah. Well, I think that was just what I was going to go on and say. So, but that is precisely why we need, and we now indeed have, that very clear transparency of process about who interacts on what. So if there are some clarifications that are sought from bidders on a particular aspect of the procurement process, and there needs to be some interaction as a result of that, but that is open and transparent, is on the record, and if there's any evidence of any...
Mike, can I just interrupt? Yeah. But on this occasion, and I just want to quote one of the bits of information TfL supplied us with. Yeah. So there's an exchange between a TfL official on an opening of the flyway, if I can call it that, Emirates Flyway, with another TfL official that says, I've spoken to Thomas Everwick and asked them what procurement process they would like to have, and they said they prefer option 3. That isn't the interaction that we would expect, would we?
It's not.
But I can list an whole number of that throughout this process of where those issues and there's been a breach in this process of round the procurement issues and all those issues.
Well, I think, Chair, absolutely, and I understand the point, and that's precisely why I've accepted Dame Margaret's recommendation on this subject, and I've accepted it, and not only that, I've ensured that it's been put in place by the...
That same information, Mike, I've got to say, was available to you
Yeah.
when we issued our report on
Yeah.
the procurement issues.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think...
It's no different.
No,
And actually, some of the issues that Dame Margaret is commenting on are issues that we've raised with you direct and with others in TfL and asked questions of.
I'm very sorry, Chair, if we didn't give the sense of urgency of dealing with these issues, but I can assure you that these are very important issues. In parallel, of course, with all these, with accepting these recommendations and changes, I've been reorganising the way that TfL runs. So, for example, we now run as a single executive committee. That was not the case previously. That was not the way the organisation operated. It now does. There's a very tight control and grip from me and the acting CFO as to how we oversee these projects. That was not actually historically the way the organisation operated. But of course, I would never have meant to be disrespectful to the work that had gone into the report of this committee.
I also want to put on the record, Chair, if I may, when the Architects Journal, as a result of receiving this information through the Freedom of Information Act, approached Arup for a comment, they were sent the following letter from their Arup Group Legal Director, and I'll quote it because I wanted to go on the record. I write further to a request for comment sent by Will Hurst of the Architects Journal to one of my colleagues. We responded to that request earlier this afternoon, but I am concerned about some of the insinuations being made in Will Hurst's email. He makes incorrect allegations against Arup, for example, in respect of collusion, that Arup broke multiple tender rules and failed to declare conflicts of interest. None of these allegations are substantiated against Arup by the contents of his email, and I'm concerned that such statements might be repeated in any published articles. Fair criticism of the Garden Bridge project is perfectly reasonable, but I cannot accept defamatory statements which would otherwise cause Arup serious harm and financial loss. I trust that you will consider these issues carefully before publishing and ensure the article, if any, is accurate and supported by facts, not supposition. Now, I'm told it's very unusual for publication to be sent a threatening legal letter before an article has even been published, simply in response to requests. And I want to put that on the record because I believe it's important that the public see the actions of a multi-billion-dollar company against a small trade publication. Does it concern you that Arup are behaving in this way, Mike?
That's not really for me to comment, Chair. I mean, what Arups choose to do from their processes is really up to them.
Dame Margaret, did you receive any legal threats during or after your review or after the publication of your report?
I certainly received a number of letters to ensure that.
Did you feel they were threatening?
There were letters there were similar sort of letters to me.
Would you name any of the organisations they came from?
Can I absolutely honest? I mean, I've got one from Arup, but I'm trying to think who else.
Could you supply the committee?
Could you supply them? So that would be, I think, very helpful for us if there's no impediment to you doing that.
I think, what I can't remember is whether I then got it from the two other people who worked there. I just can't remember.
Thank you very much. That's all I have to ask.
Okay, let's move into the final set of questions. Joanna McCartney.
Thank you. Can I start with Margaret, if I may? It seems that all this stemmed from mayoral directions. And you stated earlier that you were involved in setting up the GLA legislation. The idea was to give the mayor the power to do something bold and visionary for London. Obviously, that failed in this circumstance, and you talked earlier in your opening about an abuse of protocols, which is an extremely serious word to use. So can I ask you, where do you think, having looked at this now, the balance lies between that mayoral directive. You know, we know from the Garden Bridge that there was a lack of clarity. I think one of the participants that you interviewed stated that it wasn't predominantly a transport project, yet others said it was. You know, when a mayor is using a mayoral direction, should they ensure that it has value for money, but also that it is, if it's to TfL, for a transport purpose?
Yes, I mean, I think my answer is, I think there probably are the structures available, and actually the forms that TfL have instituted are really important, and I warmly welcome them. So, you know, it was the internal controls through internal audit and commercial, as well as the direct executive roles. So I think they're there. I think you can get it right within the framework, but what appeared to me, Len, I'm not sure if this is sort of a culture that the mayoral direction trumped everything else. And it just shouldn't. It just shouldn't. Just because you've got a policy you want to pursue, you know, no doubt in my time I've pursued rather similarly innovative policies that people might disagree with, but that doesn't mean you don't follow due process. And I think probably you can create the right balance. I don't think it needs sort of legislative changes. I don't think it needs any change in powers. You've got it there. And it's about transparency and using those powers more effectively. And I can't stress enough, transparency is so important in all these things. You know, again, with all my experience at the Public Accounts Committee, if we just had a bit more transparency, you'd get better value.
Just while we're on mayoral direction, so I just want to clarify, I think you cover it in the report, but I want it from the officers. So what do we call it? The old name, the old organisation called Investment and Performance. I understand it's renamed and rebranded. Under the Investment and Performance, mayoral directions usually go to this committee. Did any of those mayoral directions concerning the Garden Bridge go to this committee, where a number of officers would have been sitting around the table and may have actually helped Martin Clark with some of his deliberations in terms of discussions on the bits he was involved with? Did any of those mayoral directions with the Garden Bridge proposals go to that committee, to your knowledge?
Not that I remember. No, none that I remember. And in fact, I think probably see from my transcript, Margaret asked me for a note explaining why it didn't go to IPP.
Okay, can we have a copy of that note, if we can?
Can I just make a chronology point, which is quite important, Len, that the two contracts were both let before there was a mayoral.
I was going to say that, because some of the issues that come through the transcript is the defence is mayoral direction, but most of the activities that this committee has been questioning took place prior to a mayoral direction. I think the mayoral direction comes in September. The first time it ever goes to a TfL board is in July. You know, in terms of that's the first they ever hear about it. But all the activities on procurement and discussions, and inappropriate discussions, I should say, that take place are all before any of those formal issues. So I think from the committee's point of view, we want to know on the end that it was all covered by a mayoral direction. No, I don't think it was. And I think the timelines that TfL has provided, you have provided, our own timelines on issues, make that very clear about activities that were going on before that.
The two contracts were let in March and July 2013, and the first mayoral directive was in the August of that year.
I might come back to that period of time at the end of this session. Sorry, did you want to...
That's fine. And Margaret, in your report, what comes over is quite clear that once there was a mayoral directive, all sense of reason seemed to disappear from both political appointees and officers in TfL. And you make the point that actually elected politicians have to act with integrity, and our own decision-making rules here talk about the 7 principles of public life, including integrity, honesty and transparency. But you also said that the mayor's appointees in City Hall should have stood up to Boris Johnson, and the TfL commissioner should not have interpreted a clear and proper desire of the mayor as a licence to contravene procedures. So I want to just move to David, really, and ask now that you've had this report, has that made you and the Mayor think about how you need to approach mayoral directions, and what lessons did you learn from this report?
So I would start by saying that mayoral directions are clearly an important power for the Mayor. For example, to get TfL to work on the Mayor's transport strategy, an entirely uncontroversial thing, but legally a mayoral direction is required in order that TfL could do that work, or indeed to set fares. And so they have a very important legal basis, and of course, it's right as the elected Mayor that the Mayor of the day has the ability to direct and take decisions as she or he sees fit. I totally agree, and I know the Mayor does, with Margaret's point about how vital it is that this is transparent. So that's why the change, they're now all reported to TfL board. Within this building, we instituted a change in, I think, summer, maybe in September 2016, where we replaced the old Investment Informants Board, which I think had slightly fallen into disuse anyway, was the impression I got under the previous administration. And we now have a weekly corporate investment board which meets, and that consists of all the mayoral advisors and all the executive directors on the, if you like, the mayoral side of the GLA, and every single, not just mayoral direction, but every single mayoral decision that is put before the Mayor goes through that forum first, which gives everybody the opportunity to ask questions and provide challenge or raise concerns if they have them, so that everybody is cited on that. And ultimately my signature goes on every mayoral decision before it goes to the Mayor, and part of that is my check that an appropriate process has been followed and that everybody's had the chance to have their say about that. And so we absolutely have that process in place to ensure that that consideration is given, and that meeting is minuted by the Secretariat, and those minutes are published, and so there is a track record there. And then of course the mayoral decisions and mayoral directions, when there are mayoral directions made, are also published. So again, we bring that transparency. Chair, this might be a moment just to broaden slightly, with your permission. One of the things that I did before coming here was before the mayoral election, was study, I think, the November 2015 report by Deloitte to the TfL board on its effectiveness. And if the committee isn't already aware of that, that may be something you wish to consider. I think, reading between the lines, that shows a number of real issues in terms of governance at Transport for London, and something that when the Mayor came into power, and equally with a new commission as well, there's a joint determination to tackle. And I think you will see that in terms of both the appointments that have been made to the TfL board, the changes to the committees and the processes around that, the commitment to ensure that mayoral directions that relate to TfL are reported to the board and tracked by the relevant committee. And now the work that's going on in this year's board effectiveness review that the Deputy Mayor is leading, to look at standing orders and ensure that the scheme of delegation in use at TfL is appropriate. And what that really shows is, from the leadership at Transport for London and the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, and indeed myself, a real commitment to improve governance at Transport for London and try and ensure that it's at the level that it should be, given the important responsibilities the organisation carries out.
That leads me into my next question, which was to Mike actually, about the TfL board itself, because just reading the report, it seemed obvious to me that board members have a legal and fiduciary duty, and by omission they just were not carrying it out. Can you just ask you what you have done with the new board to ensure they understand their legal and fiduciary duties?
Yes, well, I think David's sort of begun to answer that, but perhaps just to add to that. So I think that the very fact that mayoral decisions, as soon as possible after they've been taken, and are reported to the full board, that didn't happen previously. There also is a quarterly summary of issues around mayoral decisions to the Audit and Assurance Committee, as well as an annual review of all those mayoral directions issued. As well as that, as I said, alluded to earlier on at the very start of this session, Chair, the restructuring of the committees of the board has been extremely helpful in separating out the Programmes and Investment Committee to allow sufficient time and scrutiny and oversight of the projects and programmes across TfL, including where decisions have been allowed to be devolved to me, and there is a review, a report of those decisions made as part of the report into the Programmes Investment Committee, separate now from the Finance Committee, which has an important role to play, but trying to run those two together was a real challenge before. And I think I should also say actually that the way that this board functions, and I think this will emerge in time following the Deputy Mayor's review of the board effectiveness now, is an entirely different way than previous boards have operated. And I think that is really helpful in terms of demonstrating proper governance and proper oversight and proper scrutiny of the executive of TfL, and indeed ensuring that mayoral decisions that are made out with the formal board process are properly reported back into it at the earliest opportunity. So I'm very confident we are in a very different place from where we were previously.
And I think the report also noted the leeway given to the Commissioner on spending decisions. Has that been tightened up, and are you more accountable?
Absolutely, and again, I think that goes back to the point I raised, Joanne, which is around the reporting of any decisions that I have made and how those are scrutinised and overseen by the Programmes and Investment Committee. And I can assure you, scrutiny of those decisions does take place, and I think that's entirely appropriate. The provisions for such delegations are in standing orders, but those, of course, are subject to review and subject to the correct level of scrutiny, which I am entirely supportive of.
Thank you. I want to go into procurement in a moment. Before I do, Dave Margaret, can I ask you, on page 21 of your, sorry, it's not page 21, page 19 of your report, you spoke to the two firms of architects that did not win the design competition, and it's quite clear from your interviews with them that, and I quote, they felt that the competition had in reality been predetermined. We feel deeply embarrassed to have been used in this way by a publicly accountable body who should know better. So did you get a sense there about the reputational risk that this facade, this fiasco had done to Transport for London in the wider world, or not?
Well, certainly there's a reputational risk, but do remember that these architectural bodies are also very dependent on gaining contracts from TfL, which is why I was surprised. I mean, before I put this into the report, I was quite clear in talking to the architects as to would they object to my putting that in the public domain, and they were quite happy about that. So reputational risk to TfL, yes, but remember this is a bit of David and Goliath, and they are, their practices depend on getting work out of TfL. So it's a very difficult position with them.
Mike, have the relationships with those firms been rebuilt, and has some progress been made?
Well, absolutely, and I can assure on the record that we will absolutely be giving them proper consideration for any further work that's bid. And in fact, I think again it's worth saying, and maybe you were going to come on to this, forgive me if I'm leaping into your next question, but it is required practice now. The evaluation of bids is conducted using specialist software which records those decisions and processes absolute transparency. There's no way that can be interfered with in any way whatsoever. It's required practice that the evaluation of these bids is carried out by more than one person to ensure that there is proper assessment of any issues that people might have concern, and is also, again, because we've got this single Chief Procurement Officer function now within our commercial team, that the proper escalation processes are also in place to ensure that, if necessary, people have access directly to me or the acting CFO or indeed the Chief Procurement Officer if they're feeling that in any way there are inappropriate or incorrect decisions being made, notwithstanding the institutional much greater certainty of process that we now have in place.
Thank you. And can I ask Dame Margaret, after hearing that and seeing what processes TfL have now instituted, are you content that they have accepted the spirit and specifics of your recommendations?
Yes, and what I would put a plea to you is please scrutinise it to make sure that it works in practice.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Caroline.
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up the process of mayoral directions, and clearly the issue, as Len has already put, is that loads of the work on the GLA Group took place ahead of any mayoral direction. In your processes now, Mike, are you telling me there's no possibility of work going ahead before a mayoral direction on something that's outside, say, the business plan?
Well, that's not actually the way it works, because there's clearly a number of things that we... So I'm hesitating to answer the question with a straight yes, because there are a number of activities that we get on and do all the time out with the business plan, so we have to manage the organisation on a day-to-day basis, and clearly that wouldn't necessarily be explicitly outlined in the business plan, and nor would you expect a mayoral direction to it. But I think in terms of major procurement decisions and decisions on projects that were, let me say, at the margin of being core transport projects, I would expect there to be the proper diligence, as is outlined in our acceptance of Dame Margaret's recommendations.
Okay, but one of the key issues around this and from mayoral direction is the role of the deputy mayor in all of this. And obviously the deputy mayor has a close relationship, they're deputy chair of the board, they're day-to-day dealing with you. And reading all the transcripts, it's quite clear the former deputy mayor said weren't involved in anything, I didn't see any of that, had no memory of most things. But the former commissioner was very, very clear that Isabel was on our backs every day. The pressure on a daily basis was absolute. So it seems to me that you could have a deputy mayor on behalf of the mayor pushing something that may not be in any of your business plans or processes, and you could feel under pressure to be doing work when there hasn't been a clear direction, a clear setting out the purpose of whatever this, even if it's just initial working up an idea. And how can you guarantee that won't happen again?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience and the evidence that I have in my experience of being commissioner, and since this current mayor has been elected, there has been no such process applied to me in any occasion whatsoever.
Okay, but what processes are being put in place? Because yes,
well,
we all know the current deputy mayor, we knew the previous one, but you could have an administration with someone trying to push something through. What's in place to stop this ever happening again?
Well, I think as outlined, the processes that are now in place, which are much more explicit and much more transparent as to mayoral decisions taken, the reporting of those to the board, the reporting of those through the Audit and Assurance Committee, the best in industry practice in terms of evaluation software for bids taking place and how the procurement is applied, the scheme of delegations, the Commissioner and my senior team, is all part of this process of ensuring a much tighter control on this that allows proper corporate governance to apply rather than any individual having undue influence or process out with such a governance arrangement.
Okay, but let's just go back.
Can I just interrupt? We ought to be careful about politicians having preferences. That's quite reasonable. And actually, chasing performance on a project is quite reasonable. What is unreasonable if you don't follow your own policies in doing it and it's not clear, and actually some of your policies that you are following in pursuing it are dubious and dodgy? Because there's another way to put it, really, because the evidence that we've got before us about the procurement process, some of the other activities, one I've quoted earlier on, which I find particularly offensive, I can name an old number that offend me, because, a number of us have been in local government. I'm a big fan of TfL. I'm a big fan of professional officers. They're one of our institutional strengths of this country. And and I talk up TfL, but at this particular occasion, I think TfL let us down in terms of the way that some activities were carried out. And I just find that It's from the evidence, from your own evidence you gave us. That's what I stress. It's not us making it up or others provide. You gave us the evidence. You gave us the issues in terms of FOI requests and others that showed that actually you've fallen short of a standard of behaviour and conduct, to be honest, in terms of pursuing this project. So I don't, in terms of, I just want to be careful, and the reason why I interrupted you is about there's nothing wrong with political preference, nothing wrong in pursuing it, and in terms of pursuing performance. But if something you have to stay within the rules and policies in pursuing those objectives.
I think, Chair, if I may, sorry, Caroline, I know you want to come back, but if I may, that's precisely why, following this new process of having these new, that suite of recommendations responded to by us and in place, alongside, I would say, with having a board, and just to emphasise, and the board effectiveness will emerge in due course as being carried out by the current Deputy Mayor, with a board that allows a much more normal interaction between me and the Chief Executive than, frankly, I ever was able to have with the previous board. So I'm being very honest with you. It's this is a very important relationship out with and notwithstanding political views, which you're quite right to say what you do, and that's absolutely correct and appropriate. But it is an important relationship when you've got a non-executive board that is part of the scrutiny and oversight on behalf of the Mayor of TfL, but that does it in line with good corporate governance. And I think that is a really important, I mean, I've worked in the private sector, I've seen how these things work, and actually I have to say, this feels much more conventional in terms of its oversight of me and my executive team, but also in the interaction and support and guidance and counsel I can get from board members in their particular specialist areas. So that's an important point to emphasise, and I think that will probably emerge in the board effectiveness review in the fullness of time.
The thing that's really, really helpful. What I just wanted to follow up is, we're saying that this can't happen again, but what happens now? So the Mayor comes up with an idea. That's what they're there for. They come up with these great ideas. In your
jungle motorway, for example. Jungle motorway.
Yeah, whatever it's going to be. But you've come up with John's got his idea already. Come up with your idea, your big idea, your weekly meetings with the Mayor and so on. That then being worked up, taken forward. Do you then ask officers maybe to do some initial scoping work, whatever? When does that then go into this formal process? So it's quite clear. The Mayor has asked us to put resources into this, to start working this up, to then start getting funding. Because this is almost drip, 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 yes. How it happened. How I can see once it gets right, we've agreed we're going to build a garden bridge, this goes into this process. But before that, when it effectively is the Deputy Mayor chasing you and the Mayor at his weekly, fortnightly meetings, where does that get picked up?
Well, I think again, just to emphasise that the way that things work now is in a very different way than might have been the case previously. So the interaction with the board and the board or the committees of the board.
It's way before this is not at the board level.
No, but I have to say, I mean, you made the point earlier on about the business plan and how we scrutinise and work to the business plan. Well, actually, what we have now is a very clear structure of how we work in this administration, which I really welcome, which we've got a Mayor's Transport Strategy, which you're aware of, which takes us to 2041. We have a 5-year business plan that is a funded and demonstrable commitment and certainty to enable us to deliver steps along the way to achieve that strategy. And then there's an annual scorecard that I produce to manage the organisation, endorsed by the board internally. Now, within that construct, that is how we ensure that we are absolutely complying with what needs to be complied. So if there is funding requested or sought out with that, then it would be my responsibility, if necessary with the support of the board, but certainly directly to the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor and David if necessary, to discuss how on earth we would come up with different funding for that. But I have to say, if you look at the raft of these recommendations taken in the round and taken also in the context of a board that operates in a different way from what we perhaps might have seen, we are in a very different arrangement. So the reason I can be quite confident in saying to you that this is not something that I could sense a creep forward, which is not your words, but what you're kind of implying about how a project would happen. I just don't think that would happen. And I would be, given that I go to all those meetings with the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor on a regular basis, I can't imagine that scenario emerging without there being proper process to scrutinise and govern it.
If I may add to that, if it's helpful. So if a project idea comes forward that requires money spent on it, clearly the officers of TfL have delegated power to spend money up to a certain point. So if, for instance, the Mayor of the day were to ask the Commissioner to write a letter to somebody,
Yeah.
the cost of a postage stamp and a piece of paper, excuse me, that's within his power. There's clearly at the point at which the expenditure that would be required would be out with and approval would be required. And that's what the standing orders of the organisation are there to do. And that's why Dame Margaret made the recommendation that we look at this area, and that's why as part of, so this is in the TfL response to Dame Margaret's report, which has been through a number of the TfL board committees and through the full board, I think in July, says that in the review of board effectiveness that is taking place now, we are going to look at those standing orders. I understand there's already been some restrictions on the Commissioner's power as a result of the change to the committee structure, which Mike already spoke about, which mean that more things go there than previously might have fallen on the desk of the Commissioner. And in what we're going to do in that review is, it's absolutely right, clearly, that the Commissioner has power to take action as the Chief Executive of the organisation in a situation where executive action needs to be taken. But equally, it is essential that appropriate approvals are in place for decisions, and that where the Commissioner has to take such action, there is appropriate quick reporting and validation of that. And so in the review of the TfL standing orders that we are going to do as part of this review, we're going to pick up that and look at it in more detail and ensure that, as an administration, we're comfortable with how that's constituted.
There's still a place at the beginning. The Mayor has the idea, jungle motorway, whatever it is, Tom's got, he sits there, perhaps got an idea, and you within your existing standing orders could say, okay, John over there, you're going to commission so-and-so consultants to work up, is it feasible? GLA officer here could do some work on it. So money, effectively, staff time and money could be spent up to a certain level before coming back saying this is a runner or not, and then if it is a runner, it will go into a process. But you could still see some money spent on mayoral ideas, but there is a point, right, this has now become a project, and you would kick in with all your new processes.
Absolutely.
Right, thank you.
What you don't do is have mates doing it. Or you'd be very clear and upfront about where it is, and you don't come halfway through your process evaluation. So the first report TfL received was on the 3rd, I think July 2016. If you look at all the other associated reports, there is a great deal of detail. Actually, there's even detail on a 25,000 spend. That was small beer to TfL on a bridge repair. There is virtually nothing on this project, and it's the first time TfL board ever received notification this is going. It's not even to the full board, it's to a subcommittee. It comes out of the blue, bypasses every check and balance to get onto the agenda and then adopted. That cannot be right. I don't mind about... Sorry?
Then there was an authority in 2013, July 2013, to spend the first 4 million.
From that board, that was why I think
that
it
was
appeared.
the Finance and Policy Committee.
That's it, but that's the first time it ever appeared in TfL board papers. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, if it had come up and said there was a proper evaluation and all the rest of it, I wouldn't be saying anything. It can't be right in the 21st century about transparency of what went on and occurred here. I'm bringing in Sean, I'm bringing in Andrew. Yep. You wanted to come in?
Yes.
Yep.
Can I ask David a couple of questions about sort of future safeguards against things like this in a more general sense? I know you've talked a lot about processes and assuming you think the processes can't be bent to meet a political force in the same way as they were in this case. I mean, there were processes in place, but the politics behind it was so forceful that nothing sort of managed to stop all this money being spent. Are you confident now that the processes can't be bent exactly in the same way? I'm sure that we do vote, there is a mandate, but under particularly strong force from an elected mayor, most processes could be bent, but maybe not. Are you confident that you're putting in place good safeguards? And to what extent does transparency form the basis of that? I know Dame Margaret was saying essentially, you know, whatever process, if you've got transparency, helps ensure the challenge and the scrutiny. Are you going to, for example, be publishing more information to do with mayoral decisions or a forward plan or things like that?
So, I think, so on the first point, I think there are two things. The first is the strength of processes. I think the processes are clearly demonstrably a lot stronger than they were, and I think that's reflected in the evidence you've heard this afternoon. There's still one or two areas that we've talked about where we need to finish our work, and we will do that. But I think there's real progress there. I think you're coming from the right perspective when you say, but yeah, in extreme circumstances, is it possible to design a process which anybody cannot subvert? The answer is, I doubt it is possible to design such a process, which brings me to my second point, that the people who operate processes are really important. And in that sense, and alluding to what was said before, elections have consequences. And that's when people take decisions at the ballot box, that feeds into what happens. In terms of your point about transparency, a decision isn't a decision until it is decided. There are strong and clear processes at the authority here that mean that all decisions are mayoral directions, which are usually, a mayoral decision is to issue a direction. And so there are strong processes that when the mayor takes those decisions, they'll be published within 24 hours, unless there is a particular reason why they need to be held back for a short period, e.g. it's going to be announced next week or something like that. You can't publish the decision ahead of the announcement. You need to publish them both at the same time. But there is that process of transparency about that, and as I say, I believe not only in maintaining that external transparency and the ways in which we've improved that with the TfL board. I know mayoral directions were also a subject of interest in the previous administration with regard to the fire authority and some of the decisions that were taken there. Now, obviously, we're hoping that the government will move the necessary secondary legislation and will change the governance structures there. And one of the things that's important when that happens is that we get the right transparency about whether to be any mayoral directions issued relating to the London Fire Brigade, that they're also visible as well. So we need to ensure that's kind of right on both where the directions are issued, but also where they're received. And if we can get the transparency right at both sides, and the governance and the oversight, then hopefully that will ensure that we're in an appropriate place.
Okay, thank you. I mean, obviously, you make a good point that elections are there ultimately to hold people to account. I think arguably in this case, if we hadn't had a change of mayor, a lot of this information would not have come out. I think we understand the decision a lot better now that Dame Margaret's had a look. Although the report that this committee made was actually potentially enough for the mayor to have made a different decision. So my question next is how do we test whether or not the new processes are working? So I wanted to make a suggestion, because we can't wait until Sadiq comes up with a jungle motorway or something equally ridiculous as that. And it strikes me that the new property fund the new property rolling property fund that the mayor is coming up with, which I think is, we don't know many of the details for that yet, but it seems like the mayor's going to be buying and selling and making lots of deals to do with bits and pieces of land. And certainly, as an Assembly member, I've had many pieces of land suggested to me already for this. I know that we all know people who would like land to be bought and used. Potentially there is some scope for mates and people who you already know, or preferences to be made for certain deals over others. And I wondered if, once some of that fund had been used, that would be an appropriate time to
Pick that up
review.
at the end. And I'd say we might need to do a bit of scoping work before we do, but I understand
I think
what
that
you're
might
saying.
be an idea. And I wanted to
idea.
ask Mike about the TfL board, and because you're doing a lot of property deals now, whether that you think the board is strong enough does it have enough property specialists to scrutinise that work that TfL is getting more and more involved in?
First of all, I would say that actually we do have a commercial development advisory group which is chaired by and populated by some property experts who advise the board on the validity and the integrity of any of any such deals that emerge in the fullness of time. And again, I have to say the link between that commercial development advisory group and the board is entirely different from where it was before, because again of the structures of the board. So I do think there are some checks and balances in place to ensure that's done correctly and appropriately, yes, but clearly I'm more than happy for any transparency on that to be reviewed over time.
Sorry, just you said that board was tasked with looking at integrity as well as...
Well, yeah, it looks at the whole process. I mean, clearly having an advisory group who have got huge experience in the property sector to represent best value for TfL and therefore taxpayers' interests as part of this is really important. And I think the board self-evidently will look to that group to properly advise them on the overall structure of any deals that we do.
Thank you. And just to say, Chair, that was a suggestion potentially for the Chief of Staff as well as for the committee in terms of what to review.
I think I can deal with that when we wrap up, because I think it's a very important issue you've raised about relationships and knowledge and how things can go wrong. So let's get there before they go wrong, not just for TfL, I think for the GLA group and housing and land. Okay, right, so Andrew,
I wasn't going to contribute, but it was something you said, Chair, about TfL and to Mr Brown. We absolutely are unanimous that TfL employs some extraordinarily talented people. Got no doubt about that whatsoever. However, sometimes it appears, as you see from this meeting on this subject and on other subjects as well, that the inspiration for their governance is less to do with glasnost and more to do with Schrödinger. We don't know anything about, we as an assembly, since I've been on here, know very little about what's going on at the moment. We only see a result produced at the end. And TfL have got to understand that is enormously frustrating for us to do our very important job of holding you to account. And we, time after time, we get people from TfL, your predecessor gave the same, saying, yes, we're dealing with it. But sometimes we feel like we're being patted on the head and said, go away, we know best, and we'll let you know when we've finished. Do you understand that about the frustration that there is when dealing with TfL?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm really sorry if we ever give that impression. That's not my style, and those who run this table who know me perhaps better than you, Andrew, will, I think, quite safe to say that's not my approach. I mean, I absolutely welcome the scrutiny from this committee and from the Assembly generally of TfL's activity. And I would also perhaps refer you, if I may, and I'm sure you do look at this, but the agendas, notes and minutes of our various committees and panels are actually hugely detailed in terms of the sort of things they cover. So as recently as this Friday, we've got coming up a very long and detailed Programme and Investment Committee, which is the new committee I referred to earlier on, which goes through in huge detail the sorts of projects that are underway, the types of delivery challenges we've got, and how those projects are progressing. And I think in that spirit, I'm determined to continue to ensure we are as open and transparent as possible. And again, I can only apologise if that hasn't always been evident to you or to the committee, but we'll continue to try harder.
I recognise you're getting better, but I also recognised it was a hell of an effort to get those into the public domain on our behalf. It was our efforts that got those into the public domain. Something about the culture of the TfL.
We ought to also say about some whistleblowers, people that were pretty brave in giving us information who clearly were unhappy at the non-professionalism that was going on around them. Because clearly at the early stages, people were giving us and supplying us information, and we should, big thank you to them, because they felt equally offended by what was taking place, not politically, because it was mostly all technical and about what was taking place under TfL's name. Okay, colleagues, I'm now going to sum up very quickly, and it doesn't preclude anything else, and we can have further discussion. So, as a minimum, I was hoping this was going to be the last time that we might be talking about the Garden Bridge, and there's a serious matter I'm going to raise later on, Mike, which is going to be a bit tough. But I want you to understand why the equivalent to this committee's foot on the back of your neck and your organisation's neck to deliver in what you've said, and I take it in good faith. And I think we've had from your predecessors, from your internal audit, we've had an interesting exchange with them. So I think we've requested various bits of information, and we do want to follow up on that. I've raised the issue about the sponsorship issues, others have raised various bits of people. Officers have kept details of that. We will remind you of that if you've not got your own notes. And the same with you, Dame Margaret, in terms of some of the information that you may have that you need to check with GLA whether it's appropriate for us to have, but we'd welcome that information because it helps us to understand and learn lessons of the future. So I think it was about minutes of meetings and what exists or doesn't exist. You've got a consultation on transparency at the moment. I don't think we formally decided we should enter into putting a contribution into that. I think we should take a decision from officers that we should. I think there's a deficiency in that because you don't talk about procurement. I think we can add to that. I think we would like to do that, and I think we should do. I think you've got. I think your closing date is the end of October. Hopefully, we could do something before then and meet your deadlines. If not, we might ask if you'd accept a late submission from us because we want to give you the best advice about what we've seen before us in terms of that. We will follow up the recommendations of your report, Dame Margaret, but also we want to follow up our recommendations as well with both TfL and with the Mayor's office around that. And certainly on the job issue, I'm looking to the head of paid service, looking to Charmaine, that will come to this body at some stage at the appropriate time. You will share some deliberations before the Mayor takes any final decision, so we could have a look at that because I know that will be an interest. Now, Sean, on the points that you've raised, I think you've raised a really interesting issue about the housing movement, both the private sector as well as the public sector. So housing associations who've now, bigger housing associations versus larger ones get $1 per subsidy. Where are they getting deals because they deliver or don't deliver? We've got private sector house builders who are different seem to be like, we did have a sort of select list model of those. I think we should look at scoping, having an informal discussion before, but thinking how best do we scrutinise that, either in terms of offering advice to the Mayor's Office on Housing and Land or to the GLA family TfL about how that can be done in a transparent way and in a way where actually no one feels there is a tainted process. There have been times in the many years I've been on this assembly where you might just question some of the aspect of some of those development or deals. And do we, dare I say, the magic word of value for money? So could we take that offline outside this? Housing committee members might need to be involved. Can we talk that through? I'm happy to convene it, chair it, but the appropriate officers in the room and think how we scope that up. Because I think it is needed and we need to think that through. And there is an element, I say to the Mayor's Office, about post-scrutiny, pre-scrutiny. We haven't quite ever solved that out. How can we do that in commercial confidential situations? But certainly seeing the same names come up time and time again can't be right in a place like London and the South East in terms of who's there and who isn't there. And we need to ask some questions about that. You might wish to comment on that scoping report as well. I don't think we're precious about that. We want to get it right in terms of the transparency of arrangements that we need to do. Now, Mike, I want to go back to two issues around this, and it revolves around decision making in TfL. And I'm in a dilemma because I've spent the weekend and the last couple of days rereading stuff and almost like sort of working my way up, and it may have come across in some of my comments about what we've had, but I don't take this bit lightly, and it would have to be with agreement of colleagues, so I've not spoken for those. So the period of time, let's go to the earlier one, the drawdown of money, about when, did they meet conditions or didn't meet conditions. In my own mind, I think there are certain bits where it's very clear they didn't. And that clearly is wrong in some ways. And I'm thinking about that. And then I go back, so I'm combining two issues. to the period of time in 2013, long before any mayoral decision, and actually in the 5 or 6 months leading up to the TfL report that Margaret referred to, of where it's the first report on the table saying, actually, this is a project, you know, out of the blue to a subcommittee, as I call it. You might have a different take on it. Now, I think there is some issues there. No doubt, I'm almost thinking that you should be allowed to write back to us on that issue of whether there was any illegality or ultra-virus activity done by TfL before it went to its TfL governance board and before you had the mayoral direction. Now, I go so insofar, I think we need some legal advice. Now, again, in the spirit of that, I don't mind, I don't see it as adversarial because I want to help to try and make sure this never happens again and we do actually learn these lessons. Because I am old school. I come from the day when councillors used to be surcharged for activities like this, as well as officers. You know, when remuneration for councillors were nothing and you were subsidising being a councillor in terms of those issues. The checks and balances don't seem to be there on terms of officials. And dare I say, I think they've been eased off politicians. I don't think they should be, but they have been eased off. That's just my personal view of that. I do think there's a case for some of the activities that took place. I'm thinking of the issue of topping and tailing internal audit reports, knowing full well the only bit that gets published is the front bit and the back bit, and you never read the full body of the bit, is quite frankly what was people trying to hide and misleading in terms of that internal process. I believe there may well be a case, and there may well be a case in the GLA, of where there is misconduct of officials. Now, I know that's something I don't take lightly about that, but I think that needs to be looked at. And I don't see how we can conclude these issues around the Garden Bridge unless we look at those issues. And that's why I think we need to take some legal advice, and I think if we do it jointly around those issues, it should. I'm not one for taking heads, but £46 million has been lost to the public purse on this project. The drawing down of money at things when, I'm not sure, you're going to write back to us whether there was due diligence done. If the due diligence is the letter that I saw go to the DTF, yeah, they've satisfied it, and with no accompanying information, that cannot be right. And I suspect you may have had something similar. I don't think that's appropriate. Please reassure me that wasn't the case and there's something more behind it. I think we would have seen it by now if there was. And I do think there's some issues there of both, and I think there is an issue for the GLA, it's not just for TfL, about what that is, and I think we need to be rest assured there, because there is a taint over us about that and those issues. So I'm recommending that last bit. You may wish to reflect whether we do that jointly, that we go through it, that we work out some mechanism to do it. I'm looking for our officers to help and work with us about how do we do that. But actually, you know, the checks and balance have been loosened somewhat, and the trust and confidence has to be there in terms of what we do and how people carry out those tasks. And I just think I want to be reassured of that. And as I said, I don't take it lightly, and I think we should move to that. I'd like to think we could do it jointly. I like to think we could. But I think we ought to, just to clear those issues, because some of the activities that took place were just inappropriate and should have been stopped if we had checks and balances to bring it back on track to do it right. I'm not saying that, you know, in terms of that, there were processes and options open to this to be done properly, and it wasn't. Would it have led to the cancellation of the project? I don't know. In different issues. I'm not really, as members know, whether people are in favour of the bridge or against the Garden Bridge. It doesn't really matter. It's not the merits of that. We're talking about the processes of arriving at where we got to and were they properly followed or not. And in this case, they were. So I'd like you to reflect on that and come back. I'd like officers to work that up if I get the agreement with the committee to do that. I do think it's about closure, but equally there is some ongoing work that we need to do to make sure it doesn't. It's not, you know, like I say, TfL has got a lot to be proud of. It's not just a London organisation. I think it's an internationally recognised organisation of good practice. I think on this occasion it slightly got let us down in terms of this for all sorts of reasons. We need, and I recognise you're trying to re-establish that grip that's required on the checks and balances. Can I thank you all for the way you've answered the questions? If you need to talk further with me, I'm happy to make myself available, but you might want to talk to our officials of how we move that further forward. Thank you very much. Now we need to go back to the main agenda. You're happy to leave. So we move on to the workforce report. Can I welcome Charmaine D'Souza, Assistant Director of HR and Organisational Development. At this time, I'm asking members, and I know you and your team have put a lot of work into this, that we don't take an introduction, that we might go straight into any questions from members, unless there is something of real major concern that you want to draw our attention. Is there anything?
None other than there's a real focus on the equalities and inclusion agenda. Very happy to take questions on that. It's set out in the paper, paragraph 10, and that work was started by my predecessor, and there'll be a real impetus behind it going forward.
Okay, are there any questions from the committee? Charlotte?
Can you very briefly, sort of expand on what the Chief of Staff was saying, that you might be involved in trying to put together a revolving doors policy? Is that...
well, as set out by both Margaret and David, there are a number of options available to both the GLA and the group. I think David set out the fact that at the heart of any policy change needs to be a view on the reasonableness and proportionality and enforceability of any change, and that will be at the heart of us going forward. There is already a confidentiality clause in the GLA contracts, but the position across the group varies, and it does vary depending on seniority of the officers and officials.
Do you know how long that work will take, and when we'll see a new policy?
We're at the early stages of scoping, so we would need to come back to the committee on that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other further questions? Okay, thank you for that. We're asked to note the report.
Just one thing,
Sorry,
detail, if I may. You obviously you monitor male and female. Do you monitor trans staff as well?
Yes, and there's a key part of policy that we need to change, a look at how we collect data and how our policies reflect that right across the piece. But yes.
So you do collect that information?
No, we
or
don't
you
do
will?
that at the
will?
moment, but policy changes will need to be made to do that.
And are they in hand?
They're not in train yet, but that will be one of the priorities that I look at.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving, so we agreed to note the report. Moving then on to item 7. This is a rapporteurship that's been discussed informally amongst the groups. Can we agree that rapporteurship?
Agreed.
Thank you. Moving on to item 8, Assembly Budget Requirement. Is there anything you wish to draw to our attention?
Thank you, Chair. No, just to say, obviously, it does, just to put on the record, it includes a growth bid, and there is funding for a potential pay rise subject to decision of the pay service later on in there as well. The discussions about funding for any such pay rise are ongoing, and obviously we would have to see what the Mayor says about the growth bid.
Thank you very much. Any questions at this stage? Fine. So we do what we're being asked to do. That's the draft budget requirement for 2018 for the recommendation for the Mayor, subject to a change in industry prior. That's blah, 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 blah. If you get what my understanding is. Okay, let's move on to item 9, draft committee timetable. We've got to point out here, we've got some scheduling issues for the future to do. We're up against PERDA, because we've got a number of mayoral strategies coming, and of course the draft timetable before us will change once we get some of those informal discussions out the way. So can we note where we are in terms of that draft timetable and move on then? I see nods. Andrew?
We, a little while ago, changed our Mayor's question times and plenary meetings to a Thursday. Have we done a review of how effective that has been?
Oh, that's good. Good point. Can we make sure that is done, and can it be circulated to not just this committee but back to all Assembly members?
I think it's been quite effective, but that's just my perception.
And maybe programme an item into the Bureau of Leaders if it's appropriate. Yeah. Sorry, Kate.
Just to add, Andrew, I think you're right. Where monitoring of the media pickup does show that it has improved, but we can certainly look at that in a slightly more scientific way.
Good point. Okay, moving on to 10 work programme. We're asked to notify the work programme, and of course if there's other additional issues we can discuss those outside the meeting. Can we note that?
Agreed.
Okay, 11, date of the next meeting is Thursday 23rd of November 2017 at 10 a.m, committee room 5. There being any other urgent business, I declare this meeting closed. Thank you.